It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the remote wilderness of northern Idaho. I was 28 years old then, working a desk job I hated, craving a break from everything. The plan was simple: hike a tough, but manageable, 15-mile loop through the Selkirk Mountains, camp overnight, and then head back the next day. I had done plenty of hikes before, but never alone, and certainly not in such a wild, isolated area. I packed carefully: a good tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, enough food for 2 days, extra clothes, a compass, and a detailed topographical map of the trail. My phone had limited service, but I told a friend where I'd be, what time to expect me back, and when to raise an alarm if I didn't check in. I felt confident, prepared, and eager. The first day started well. The air was fresh and cool under the dense canopy of towering pine and fir trees. The trail was narrow and rocky, winding up and down steep hills. I passed small clearings where the sun touched the forest floor in patches of warm light. Birds chirped, squirrels darted between trees, and the distant sound of a creek flowing was steady and calming. The hike was tough but not overwhelming. The weight of my pack was heavy but manageable. As afternoon faded into early evening, I reached a clearing near a small alpine lake. I decided to set up camp there. The water was crystal clear, the surface still except for the occasional ripple from a jumping fish. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, gathered firewood, and started a small fire, cooking a simple meal of instant noodles and canned beans. I let myself relax, feeling completely isolated but strangely at peace. But then something odd started to happen. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the forest around me grew unnervingly silent. The usual evening sounds, bird calls, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals, disappeared. Even the wind seemed to die down. The stillness felt unnatural, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to take a short walk around the lake before dark. The path was faint and rocky, winding through thick underbrush. As I walked, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy, and unlike anything I recognized from the local wildlife. They were human footprints, no doubt, but oddly spaced and inconsistent, as if whoever made them was stumbling or moving awkwardly. The prints led away from the lake into the denser forest. I followed cautiously for a while, but the deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I felt. The trees grew closer, the shadows longer and darker. Then I heard it, a distant, low crunching sound, like heavy footsteps snapping twigs. But no clear shape or figure appeared. My heart rate picked up. I turned back to camp as quickly as I could, the flashlight in my hand barely cutting through the growing darkness. I told myself it was probably a deer or a large animal moving through the undergrowth, but the silence still felt wrong, too quiet for something like that. Back at the campsite, I double-checked my tent, locked my food container to keep animals away, and sat near the fire, the only source of warmth and light. I stared into the flickering flames, trying to calm my nerves. But every now and then, I'd catch a movement just beyond the firelight. Shadows shifting, branches bending, faint noises that didn't belong. Suddenly, a sharp snap from the woods made me freeze. I strained my eyes toward the noise, trying to see any sign of what it was. Nothing. Then another snap, closer this time, and the faint sound of heavy breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the edge of the tree line. A figure stood there, partially hidden by the trees, tall and hunched. My heart slammed against my ribs. The beam from my flashlight trembled as I held it up. The figure didn't move, just watched. I couldn't see a face clearly, but the outline was distinctly human. It was too dark to see much else. Panic surged. I grabbed my pack, deciding not to wait around. I could hear more footsteps now, slow but deliberate, approaching from different directions. Whatever was out there was not a wild animal. I stuffed the food container into my bag and extinguished the fire quietly. My eyes darted nervously through the darkness. Without hesitation, I started walking fast, off the trail, away from the lake and into thicker trees, hoping to lose whoever was out there. My heavy boots thudded on the dry leaves and twigs as I pushed forward. My breath came in sharp gasps. The forest felt like a maze, but I kept moving, trying to head toward the direction of the trailhead marked on my map. Behind me, I heard crashing noises, branches breaking, leaves crunching, clearly following me. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Was it a lost hunter? Poacher? Someone dangerous? I had no way of knowing, only the terrifying certainty that I was not alone and was being watched. I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, my heart pounding as I forced myself back up. My flashlight flickered and died. I was left with only the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. Panic gave way to cold, hard focus. I dug out a spare battery and replaced it, switching the light back on. I scanned the shadows, but nothing moved. Then I found a small creek. I remembered from the map that following the creek downstream should lead me to a ranger station, or at least a road. I followed the water's edge, walking faster despite the rough ground. The noises behind me grew more distant, but never completely stopped. After what felt like hours, I saw the faint glow of a cabin light through the trees. Relief washed over me. I hurried toward it, hoping for help. The door opened and an older man stepped out, surprised to see me so late. He explained that the area had recently been the focus of a manhunt. A dangerous criminal had escaped custody and was believed to be hiding in the woods near the lake where I camped. That explained the strange footprints, the silence, and the feeling of being watched. The man urged me to stay put while he radioed for help. The next morning, I was escorted out by a search team. They told me the suspect was caught hours after I left, deep in the forest, armed and desperate. The whole experience felt surreal. How close I'd been to danger without even knowing it. Back home, I replayed everything in my mind. The silence, the footprints, the watching figure. It wasn't supernatural, no fantasy monsters, no ghosts. It was a very real, very human threat, one that nearly ended badly. I learned then that the wilderness isn't just about nature. Sometimes it hides dangers far worse than anything you expect. And sometimes your survival depends not on luck or skill, but on staying calm and moving quickly when you realize you're not alone. Since that trip, I've never gone hiking alone again. The woods are beautiful, but they hold secrets, real, dangerous secrets. And no matter how prepared you think you are, you never truly know what waits just beyond the trees. I remember that hiking trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened nearly 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2015. I was 26, and I had been planning a solo hike deep into the Cascades, near a place called Goat Creek, not far from Seattle. I wanted to get away from everything, the noise of the city, the endless emails, the people, just me, the trees, and the wilderness for 3 days. What I didn't expect was how quickly things would go wrong, and how close I'd come to something that still haunts me every time I'm near the mountains. The first day went well. The weather was clear. The sun was warm but not too hot. The trail started easy enough, a dirt path winding through tall pines and thick undergrowth. I was careful with my gear. Backpack with food, water, first aid kit, a map, a compass, and a flashlight. I kept a detailed mental log of where I was, checking the map every hour. Around midday, I stopped to eat by a small creek, where the water was clear and cold. I refilled my bottle, feeling refreshed. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, sharp and clean. As I went further in, the trail became less defined. I figured it was just the normal rough terrain. But then I noticed the trail markers, small orange ribbons tied to branches, started to disappear. At first, there were still some, but after a while, none at all. The dirt path turned into patches of rock and moss. The trees grew closer, blocking the sun. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to pinpoint my location. According to the map, I was supposed to hit a small ridge overlooking Goat Creek by late afternoon, but I couldn't see anything resembling a ridge, just endless trees. I started feeling uneasy, not the kind of fear you get from horror movies, but a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach that something was off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. I kept moving, hoping to find the trail again or at least get to the ridge. After about an hour, I came to a clearing. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by thick bushes and tall firs. In the middle was a large flat rock, covered in scratches and what looked like old claw marks. I don't know why, but seeing that rock made me pause. Something about it felt unnatural. I scanned the edges of the clearing but didn't see any animals. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe a bear had been there. I decided to rest for a few minutes, then head back the way I came to find the trail. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a low, steady thumping coming from deeper in the woods. I froze. The sound wasn't like anything natural. No animal footsteps, no wind or falling branches, just a rhythmic pounding, like someone or something hitting a tree trunk with a heavy object. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself I was alone, but I was prepared, and I wasn't going to panic. I packed up quickly and began retracing my steps. But as I moved, the noise seemed to follow me, keeping pace just beyond the edge of the trees. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen. The thumping would stop for a moment, then start again, closer. I realized I had no way to call for help. My phone had no signal, and my emergency beacon was still packed deep in my backpack. I was in trouble. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and I knew I couldn't stay out here all night. I looked around for a safe place to camp. I needed somewhere open enough to see if whatever was out there approached, but sheltered enough to stay warm. I found a spot near a large boulder, close to the creek from earlier. I set up my small tent, laying out my gear carefully. I made sure to keep my knife and flashlight within reach. As the night grew darker, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets, frogs, owls, but the thumping was gone. I wondered if I'd imagined it or if whatever made it had moved on. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jump. Hours passed in fitful rest, my ears straining for the slightest hint of movement. At around 3 a.m., something woke me fully. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration through the ground. Slow, heavy footsteps, not like a deer or a bear. These were deliberate, measured steps. I stayed still, my breath shallow, watching the faint glow of my flashlight through the tent's mesh window. Then I saw it. Two large shapes moving silently between the trees. They weren't animals. Too tall, too upright. I could just barely make out a figure holding what looked like a large stick or a piece of wood. My mind raced. Was it hunters? Or something worse? I decided not to make a sound. I reached for my emergency beacon, hands shaking, but I froze. The figures stopped near the clearing where I had seen the claw marks. They didn't come closer. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they turned and walked away. T dawn. I didn't wait. I packed up as fast as I could and started moving back the way I thought was safest, using the sun as a guide. I avoided the clearing. I stuck to open areas and tried to keep track of landmarks. After about 4 hours of careful hiking, I finally stumbled onto a wider trail that I recognized from my map. I followed it until I reached a ranger station where I could get help. I told the rangers what I'd seen. They listened, but there was no record of any search or rescue teams or hunters in that area. They told me it might have been poachers or illegal loggers. The claw marks? Maybe bears or other animals scratching territory. The strange footsteps? Could have been anyone. They warned me to be more careful and said they would send patrols. I never went back to that part of the Cascades again. But every time I'm in the mountains or deep forests, I remember those heavy steps, the silence, and those two figures in the dark. It wasn't some ghost or monster. It was something real and dangerous, human or not. Something that stalked the woods, watching. And it made me realize just how unprepared I was. How quickly the wilderness can turn from peaceful to threatening when you're alone, lost, and unsure who or what is out there. That trip changed the way I think about hiking and safety forever. It taught me respect, not just for nature, but for the unseen people who live and move in those shadows, far from the trailheads and ranger stations. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't made-up stories. They're just the raw, quiet truths hidden in the wild. And when you're out there alone, those truths can be enough to keep you awake at night, long after you've left the forest behind. I set out on my hike early one spring morning in 2018, choosing a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia. I was 28 at the time, an experienced hiker who liked the solitude of long treks far from crowded paths. The weather was clear and cool, the kind that sharpens your senses and makes the forest smell fresh and alive. My pack was loaded with the usual essentials: water, some trail mix, a basic first aid kit, a map, and a small flashlight. I planned to be back before dark, so I didn't bring much more. The trail was rugged but well-marked, winding through thick stands of oak and pine, with occasional bursts of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I had been hiking for about 3 hours when I noticed something odd. The trail started to get rougher, the path narrower, and the markers less frequent. At first, I thought maybe I'd taken a wrong turn or the trail was just less traveled here. I stopped to check my map and GPS. Both showed the same trail, but the signs on trees were missing, faded, or painted over. It felt like I was entering an area where few people came. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birdsang, no insects vast. Even the wind seemed to die down among the tall trees. The silence was thick, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The crunch of my boots on leaves, the snap of a twig nearby. I told myself it was normal for parts of the woods to be quiet sometimes, but it put me on edge. After another hour, I came across an old, rusty metal gate blocking the path. It was barely standing, leaning to one side, with a faded sign nailed to it. I could just make out the words, "Private property," and "No trespassing." This surprised me. According to the map, the trail shouldn't have any private land here. I looked around, no houses, no roads, just thick forest spreading in every direction. I debated turning back, but decided to squeeze through a gap at the side of the gate and keep going. I reasoned that maybe the map was outdated and the trail rerouted. As I pushed through the underbrush, I realized the ground was getting wetter, the soil soft and muddy beneath my feet. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick with moss and vines. Sunlight was almost non-existent here. Then I noticed something else: broken branches and crushed plants off the path, signs of something large moving through the area. The trail had faint footprints, but they weren't human. They were bigger, wider, and the pattern was strange. I tried to focus on the ground and remember the shape, but the mud distorted them too much. I didn't hear anything at first, but then a low, deep growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't a bear or a wolf, at least not one I recognized. It was slower, deliberate, and somewhere close but hidden. My heart jumped. I grabbed my hiking pole tighter and scanned the forest. There was no movement, only shadows between the trees. I kept walking, trying to stay calm and not make noise. But the growling came again, this time closer, and mixed with heavy breathing. I could hear twigs snapping off to my right. Something was following me. I quickened my pace but didn't run. I knew running could provoke a chase or cause me to trip in the rough terrain. The trail curved sharply and opened into a small clearing with a stream running through it. I paused to drink some water and check my pack. That's when I saw it. A large, mangy dog-like creature standing at the edge of the trees across the stream. It wasn't a wolf, at least not a healthy one. Its ribs showed through dirty fur. Its eyes fixed on me with a wild, feral glare. The thing was growling low and slowly circling, staying just out of reach. My mind raced through what I knew about wild animals. It was too thin to be a normal wild dog or wolf, maybe abandoned or feral. The way it moved was unsettling, jerky, but deliberate, as if it was hunting. I knew I couldn't let it get between me and the path back. I looked around and spotted a fallen branch near the water's edge. I grabbed it, ready to defend myself if needed. The creature's growl turned into a harsh bark, took a step forward, then stopped, watching me. I slowly backed toward the trail, keeping my eyes locked on the animal. My breathing was shallow, and my legs shook, but I kept moving. The creature mirrored my movement, blocking my path at every turn. I realized it had the area cornered, like it was guarding something or just didn't want me leaving. Then I remembered the gate and the sign. Maybe this was someone's guard dog gone wild, or worse, left to roam in the woods. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I needed to get out of here. At that moment, I heard a sudden rustling behind me, branches breaking under heavy weight. I spun around, raising the branch, but saw nothing except trees. My heart hammered so loudly I thought the creature might hear it and attack. I turned back to the path, saw the animal crouching as if preparing to lunge. I raised the stick and shouted loudly, throwing it toward the creature. It yelped, stepped back, but didn't run. It snarled and stayed where it was. I knew I had to make a break for it. With no other choice, I dashed across the clearing and scrambled up a steep embankment that led to a wider trail. The creature barked and chased after me, but the rough terrain slowed it down. I didn't stop running until I reached a main path I recognized, where I could hear distant sounds of traffic from a nearby highway. I looked back, but the creature was gone. I kept walking until I reached the ranger station at the trailhead. They listened when I told them about the feral animal and the gate blocking the path. Turns out, an old private hunting reserve had been abandoned years ago, and some people had reported seeing wild dogs and coyotes acting strangely in the area. The ranger warned me to stay on marked trails and never try to go through fenced or private areas. He said the forest could be dangerous in unexpected ways, not just from wild animals, but from people who didn't want trespassers. That experience taught me that wilderness is never truly safe, even when it looks peaceful. There are risks you can't always prepare for. Wild animals pushed out of their normal habitats, hidden private lands, and the loneliness that comes with being miles from help. I still hike, but I never take shortcuts or ignore warning signs anymore. I was lucky that day. The feral dog didn't catch me, and I found my way back before dark. But every time I go hiking now, I remember that growl, the way those wild eyes locked on me, and how quickly things can change when you're alone in the woods. It's a reminder that nature doesn't care about your plans. It just is, and sometimes it's watching. I had been planning this solo hike for months. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 29 years old. The trail I chose was in the remote parts of the Cascade Mountains, Washington State, a place I had read about in old hiking forums, praised for its beauty but also known for how easy it was to get lost. I had done plenty of hikes before, but this one was different. I wanted to push myself to be alone in the wilderness for 3 days with just a backpack, a map, and a compass. No cell signal, no distractions, just me and the wild. The first day was everything I expected. Clear skies, the sound of birds, the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. The forest was dense, with tall pine trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I moved slowly, stopping often to take photos and drink water. I followed the marked trail on my map, and by nightfall, I set up camp near a small creek that babbled softly. My tent was a cheap but sturdy model, and I was careful to set it up on a flat patch of ground away from the waterline. That night, I slept well. The quiet was peaceful, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I was excited for the next day. I had planned to hike deeper into the wilderness, where few people ever went. The map showed an old fire lookout tower about 10 miles north. I wanted to reach it by the end of day 2. Day 2 started cool and crisp. I packed my gear, filled my water bottle, and double-checked my compass. The trail soon became less distinct, more covered in fallen branches and pine needles. I had to pay close attention to the map and compass to stay on course. After a few hours, the trail disappeared altogether. I found myself walking on narrow animal paths, twisting between thick underbrush and tall trees. The sun was high now, shining through the canopy, casting flickering shadows on the ground. That's when I noticed it, footprints. Not human, but something larger. Deep, heavy prints in the soft soil, maybe from a big animal. I stopped to study them. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old. The prints were uneven, as if the creature had been limping or favoring one leg. My heart quickened a little, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a moose. Still, I stayed alert. As the afternoon went on, I kept following the footprints, curious where they might lead. It was a mistake. The prints led me off any trail and into thick forest where I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. I moved slowly, carefully stepping over roots and stones. My boots were getting muddy from a small stream crossing, and my legs were tired from climbing up and down steep slopes. Around 4 p.m., I realized I had no clear sense of direction anymore. The compass was steady, but the terrain was confusing. Every ridge looked the same, every tree seemed familiar. I tried to stay calm, but the sinking feeling of being lost crept in. I decided to stop and rest, hoping to figure out a plan. I sat on a fallen log, took a swig of water, and checked my map again. The fire lookout tower should be north, but I had no idea if I was heading that way or not. The sun was lowering in the sky now, and shadows stretched longer. I stuffed my map and compass back into my jacket and looked around. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. That silence made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a faint snapping of twigs somewhere behind me. Not close, but not far either. I froze. My eyes scanned the darkening trees. The snapping came again, slow and deliberate, like someone or something moving carefully through the brush. My mind raced. Could it be a person, another hiker, or an animal? I stood up quickly, grabbing my small folding knife from my belt. I tried to steady my breathing and reminded myself I was trained to handle situations like this. The noise stopped, and everything went silent again. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to make noise to scare off whatever it was. My foot hit a rock, sending it rolling down the slope. The sound echoed sharply. Suddenly, a large shape darted through the trees about 50 feet away. It was too fast to see clearly, but it was big, larger than any deer I'd seen. My heart hammered as adrenaline surged. I backed away slowly, turning to head in the direction of where I thought the trail was. But as I moved, I realized I was even more lost. The terrain was steep and rough. I kept walking, trying to keep calm, trying to remember my route. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and darkness started swallowing the forest. I didn't have a flashlight. My phone was dead from no signal and no charging. Panic was setting in, but I forced myself to keep moving. After about an hour of stumbling through the dark, I tripped over a root and fell hard on my knee. Pain shot through my leg, but I got up. The forest was now completely dark except for the faint glow of stars through the canopy. I couldn't see the trail. The sounds of the forest had changed. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howl of a coyote. I found a small clearing and decided to set up my tent there, even though it wasn't ideal. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the tent and wrestled with the poles. I was cold and scared, but I had no choice. The thought of staying out in the open all night terrified me. When the tent was finally set, I crawled inside, zipped it up tight, and pulled my jacket over me. The night was long. Every little sound outside made me jump. The wind rattled the tent fabric, and the shadows beyond the mesh walls looked like figures moving just out of sight. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the shape I saw earlier, wondering if it was a bear or a mountain lion. I didn't have bear spray or any weapon, just that small knife. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of the tent and took stock of my situation. My knee was swollen and sore, but I could walk. The good news was I found the trail again nearby. Somehow, I had circled back without realizing it during the night. I started hiking slowly back toward the trailhead, careful to avoid slipping. The sun was warm now, and birds were singing again. The forest felt less threatening in the daylight. Every step forward was relief. About 4 hours later, I reached the parking area where my car was. That morning, as I sat inside the car, I thought about what had happened. The footprints I followed were from a big bear, probably injured, which explained the limp. The shape I saw darting through the trees was the bear moving away from me. I was lucky it didn't come closer. Being lost in the dark with an injured leg could have ended badly. I realized how easy it was to underestimate the wilderness. No ghost stories or legends, just the real dangers of nature. Getting lost, facing wild animals, and the cold, dark night. I had prepared well, but still ended up in a situation where luck and calm thinking saved me. After that hike, I learned to respect the forest even more. I always carry extra supplies now. Flashlight, first aid, bear spray, and I never follow unknown tracks or leave marked trails without a solid plan. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. That day in the Cascades reminded me that survival depends on preparation, awareness, and staying calm, no matter how scary things get. The summer of 2017 was the year I decided to hike the remote trails of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I was 27 then, fit but not an expert. I had done a few day hikes before, but nothing this long or isolated. My plan was simple: a 3-day solo trek on the lesser-known Loop Trail near Mount Moosilauke. I packed light, carrying only the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, water purification tablets, some dried food, a first aid kit, and a map I had printed from an old hiking forum. No phone service, no GPS, just me and the wilderness. The first day went well. The trail was steep and rocky but breathtaking. The forest was thick with pine trees, and the smell of earth after a recent rain hung in the air. I passed by a small stream, stopped for water, and filled my bottle, careful to use the purification tablets later. I was alone, but the silence felt peaceful, not eerie. My legs ached by the evening, but the stars were clear, and I fell asleep under a blanket of them. The trouble began on the second day. I woke early, packed up my tent, and continued on the narrow path. The forest started to thin out, giving way to open ridges with vast views. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail where the map showed a shortcut through a valley to cut some time. The shortcut was not well marked, but I thought I could handle it. The air was warmer, and a slight breeze moved the tall grass as I stepped off the main trail. At first, the valley looked inviting: wildflowers, a trickling creek, and birds chirping. But after about an hour, the path became harder to follow. There were no markers, just faint tracks that could have been made by hikers or animals. The trees here were spaced out, and patches of fog started creeping in, lowering visibility. I stopped, looked at the map again, and realized I might have taken a wrong turn. I turned back to retrace my steps, but quickly noticed the landmarks didn't match the map anymore. The creek I was following seemed to fork in multiple directions, and none looked familiar. My heart began to beat faster. I was sure this valley was smaller than the map showed, or maybe the scale was off. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had a compass, but the needle didn't seem to point consistently. I figured maybe my compass was affected by the iron in the rocks or some natural magnetic anomaly. By late afternoon, the fog thickened. It clung to the trees and the ground like a wet blanket. The temperature dropped quickly. I was still trying to find the main trail, but every direction I walked seemed to loop me back to the same spot. A large, mossy rock shaped oddly like a small hill. I tried to mark my path with small piles of stones and broken branches, but after a while, the fog distorted everything. The piles looked different or disappeared altogether. I sat on a fallen log, my breath visible in the cold air. I was hungry and tired, my water supply running low. The thought of spending the night lost in this valley unsettled me, but I knew I had to prepare for it. I set up my small tent as best as I could on a patch of dry ground sheltered by thick bushes. It wasn't the safest spot, but the forest floor was damp everywhere. That night was the hardest. Sounds filled the fog, the snap of twigs, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls that seemed unusually close. The silence was heavy, almost pressing. I kept telling myself it was just deer or birds, but the noises were relentless. My flashlight's weak beam barely pierced the fog. I checked my supplies again. I had some extra food, but I was worried about water. The creek was somewhere close, but I couldn't find it in the fog. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing. I thought about what would happen if I couldn't find my way out the next day. The worst part was the uncertainty. I wasn't scared of anything supernatural, but I was scared of being truly alone and lost, without help or communication. The next morning, the fog had lifted slightly, but the sky was gray, and a steady drizzle began. I packed my tent, my clothes damp and cold. I knew I had to find the creek to refill my bottle and get back on track. I chose a direction where I thought I heard running water the day before. The hike through the thick brush was slow. I slipped on wet rocks and tangled in branches. After an hour, I finally found the creek, swollen from the rain but clear. I filtered water and drank deeply, feeling a bit more hopeful. I checked the map and compass again. The compass was still acting strangely, so I decided to rely on the sun's position. I started walking east, hoping that would take me back to the main trail. After some time, the trees grew denser, and suddenly I saw a glimpse of a worn path. My heart leaped. I hurried forward and found a small wooden sign nailed to a tree, faded but legible, Moosalauk Trail. Relief washed over me. Following the trail was easier, but the rain was getting heavier, making the rocks slippery and the path muddy. My boots were soaked, and I was exhausted. Still, the idea of finding a way out pushed me forward. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing where the trail met a logging road. I saw tire tracks and a distant fence, signs of civilization. I took out my phone, and to my surprise, I had a faint signal. I called the ranger station and explained my situation. They told me a search team was ready to head out, as someone had reported me missing. I felt a wave of shame and relief all at once. The rescue team found me near the logging road about an hour later. They said the fog in that valley was notorious for confusing hikers, especially with the magnetic anomalies messing up compasses. They praised me for staying calm and marking my path. That night, back at a nearby lodge, I sat by the fire, drying my clothes and reflecting on the experience. The woods hadn't been haunted or cursed, just wild, unpredictable, and indifferent. The real terror was the feeling of being lost, of your senses betraying you, and the creeping doubt that no one might find you in time. I learned a lot that trip. Never underestimate nature's power to disorient you. Always stick to marked trails, double-check your tools, and carry extra supplies. Most importantly, respect how alone you can truly feel in the wilderness. It took days for me to shake the unease that stayed after the hike. The memory of the fog, the looping valley, and the cold silence haunted me. Not because of monsters, but because it was so real. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are those that could happen to anyone, in the middle of nowhere with nothing but yourself to rely on. I was 27 when I decided to hike the Lost Ridge Trail, a remote path tucked deep into the northern mountains of Idaho. It was early September 2017, and the air had just started to turn crisp, carrying the scent of pine and fallen leaves. I wasn't new to hiking, far from it, but Lost Ridge had a reputation for being one of the more challenging and isolated trails in the region. It was said to stretch for about 12 miles, winding through dense forests, steep inclines, and rocky outcrops with little cell signal to speak of. Perfect, I thought, for a weekend escape. I started early one Saturday morning, carrying a well-packed backpack, water, food, a first aid kit, and a basic map I'd printed from the ranger station website. The trailhead was quiet, just a dirt parking lot surrounded by thick spruce trees. The sun was just breaking through the canopy when I took my first steps into the woods. At first, the hike was peaceful. The sound of dry leaves crunching under my boots, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the steady rhythm of my breath filled the silence. The path climbed gradually, passing moss-covered rocks and wildflowers that still clung to the last warmth of summer. About 2 miles in, the trail narrowed and the trees grew taller, casting long shadows across the ground. I was alone, no other hikers in sight. Around mid-morning, I reached a small clearing. A shallow stream trickled through, its water crystal clear and icy cold. I knelt down to refill my water bottle, careful not to slip on the wet stones. As I drank, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the mud near the bank. They weren't deer or any animal I recognized. The prints were too large, flat, and spaced strangely, almost like heavy boots. My heart quickened for a moment, but I shrugged it off. People did hike here, even if I hadn't seen anyone this morning. I continued on, but the feeling of being watched crept in. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a prickling at the back of my neck. The forest grew thicker, and the sunlight dimmed under the heavy canopy. The trail twisted and turned sharply, sometimes climbing over fallen logs or skirting narrow ledges. At one point, I had to use my hands to steady myself on slick rocks. Around noon, I stopped for a break on a flat rock overlooking a steep drop. The view was breathtaking. A vast sea of green treetops stretching to distant mountains under a pale blue sky. I ate a sandwich slowly, savoring the quiet and the solitude. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a low rustling sound coming from the forest below the cliff. I froze, listening. The rustling grew louder, like branches snapping, heavy footsteps pushing through brush and undergrowth. I scanned the trees but saw nothing moving. My pulse sped up again. Whoever or whatever was there wasn't following the trail. They were off the path, deeper in the woods. I packed up quickly and continued, my eyes darting around more than usual. The trail started descending now, and the trees closed in tighter. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy for any normal wildlife. An hour later, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains. I needed to find a good spot to camp before darkness settled. The trail led to a small ridge with a flat clearing, perfect for a tent. I set up my shelter and started a fire, grateful for the warmth and the sense of safety it gave me. The forest around me felt alive in a different way at night. Shadows shifting, small animals scurrying, the crackle of twigs breaking far away. As I ate dinner, the rustling noises started again, louder and closer this time. It wasn't just footsteps, but something scraping against trees, breaking branches. My stomach tightened. I stayed close to the fire, watching the dark woods beyond the flames. I tried to keep calm and remind myself it was probably a hunter or some other hiker who'd lost the trail. But my mind raced with other possibilities. I remembered reading reports about poachers and illegal loggers in the area. People who didn't want to be found, who might be dangerous. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow just beyond the firelight, moving quickly between the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around, but nothing was there. The next morning, I broke camp early, eager to get off the ridge and back to the trailhead. I decided to take a slightly different route, following the map carefully to avoid any shortcuts that might put me back near where I'd heard the strange noises. About halfway down, I stumbled on more footprints, just like the ones I'd seen by the stream, but fresher this time. The mud was soft, and the prints were deep, as if whoever had made them was carrying a heavy pack. What made me uneasy was that they seemed to circle around the trail in places, not just follow it straight. Like whoever was out there was watching, waiting. My breathing became shallow. I knew the cell signal would be spotty, but I pulled out my phone and checked. 1 bar, enough to send a quick text if needed. I texted my sister with my location and plans, just in case. As the afternoon passed, I quickened my pace, eyes constantly scanning the trees and shadows. I avoided any thick brush or places where I might be easily hidden from view. My legs ached from the steep downhill, but adrenaline kept me moving. Then I heard it again, a loud snap behind me, closer than before. I turned quickly, flashlight ready, but saw nothing. The forest was silent now, except for my own heavy breathing and the sound of leaves underfoot. I stopped, heart pounding, and thought hard. I didn't want to assume the worst, but something wasn't right. I decided to pick up my pace even more, aiming for the last 2 miles. Near dusk, the trail opened into a clearing that led to a small dirt road. I heard a car engine in the distance, a rare sound out here. Relief flooded over me. I jogged toward the road, and soon I saw a parked truck with a man sitting inside, the headlights off. I called out and waved my arms. The man rolled down his window, looking surprised but not hostile. I told him where I'd been and how long I'd been hiking. He nodded and said he'd been patrolling the area for a forestry service. When I mentioned the strange noises and footprints, his expression hardened. "You weren't alone out there," he said quietly. "There have been reports of illegal hunters moving through this forest, and they don't take kindly to visitors. You got lucky. A lot of people just disappear in these parts." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I thanked him and asked for a ride back to the trailhead. On the drive, I kept glancing back at the dark tree line, thinking about how close I'd been to whatever was out there. That night, safe in a motel bed with a locked door between me and the woods, I finally let myself relax. The forest was beautiful, but out there, beneath the trees and shadows, something dangerous lurked, something very real. And I knew I'd never take a hike like that again without knowing exactly who else was around. The wilderness isn't just about nature. It's about the people hiding inside it too. I set out on that hike in the spring of 2014. I was 27, alone, and ready for something quiet, something to break the buzz of the city life I'd been stuck in for months. The trail I picked was in the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. It was supposed to be moderate, well marked with plenty of scenic views. I had a small backpack with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and my trusty multi-tool. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. Hiking was something I'd done a lot, but this trip ended up teaching me just how quickly nature could turn from peaceful to terrifying. I started early, just after dawn. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, and the forest smelled like pine and wet earth. Birds were chirping here and there. The first few miles were easy, just a steady climb through thick trees and mossy rocks. The trail was soft underfoot, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. I felt calm, almost too calm, like the world was waiting for something to break the silence. Around midday, I reached a clearing near a small stream. I sat down on a rock, ate a granola bar, and refilled my water bottle. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting shifting shadows on the ground. I checked my map, planned to push further into the forest before turning back. The trail forked nearby, one path heading deeper into the wilderness, the other looping back toward the main road. I took the left fork, wanting to see more of the wild. This is where things began to feel off. First, it was small things. The trail grew narrower and less defined. I had to step over fallen logs and scramble around thorny bushes. The trees here were older, taller, and closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air got colder, even though the sun was still high. The sounds of birds faded until there was only the quiet rustling of the wind and my own footsteps. Then, I noticed the trail markers, those little strips of orange tape tied to branches, started to disappear. I looked around but couldn't find any new ones ahead. My map was old, and I realized this part of the trail might not be maintained regularly. Still, I pressed on, trusting my sense of direction. After an hour, I reached a small ridge overlooking a deep valley. The view was stunning. Layers of green forests, rivers snaking through the land, and distant mountains with snowy peaks. I stopped to take it all in, took out my phone for a quick photo. That's when I noticed my signal was gone. No surprise there, but I made a mental note that I was off the beaten path. When I turned to head back, I realized I didn't recognize the trail. The narrow path I'd come on seemed to disappear into thick bushes, and there was no clear way forward or back. My heart rate picked up. I checked my compass. The direction matched the map, but the landscape didn't. The forest looked denser and stranger, with twisted trees and fallen branches blocking any clear route. I tried to retrace my steps, backtracking carefully, but every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the thicket. After about 30 minutes, I was certain I was lost. The first real sign of danger came when I heard something moving in the underbrush nearby. It wasn't an animal I knew. No birds, no squirrels, nothing familiar. It was heavier, slower, and something about the way the leaves rustled made me freeze. My skin prickled. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched. For the first time in a long while, fear crept in. I started walking faster, scanning the trees around me. I didn't have a weapon beyond my multi-tool, which I held tightly in my hand. The forest around me was eerily silent again, except for distant cracking branches. I told myself it was probably a deer or a large animal like a bear, but I had no bear spray, no way to call for help, and no clue which way to go. I decided to follow the sun, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. But the thick canopy made the sunlight patchy and unreliable. I was stumbling over roots and rocks, cutting myself on thorns, getting scratched and bruised. My water was running low. Hunger started gnawing at me, though I tried not to think about it. I didn't want to panic. Hours passed. The sky began to dim, and the forest shadows grew long. I stopped to rest against a tree and checked my watch. Already 6 p.m. I hadn't seen any signs of the main trail or any other hikers. The temperature dropped noticeably. I knew I wouldn't make it out before dark if I kept wandering like this. I found a small hollow near the base of a large pine tree and decided to stay there for the night. I gathered some dry leaves and branches to make a rough bed and covered myself with my jacket. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to keep warm and stay calm. The forest noises changed at night. Owls called out occasionally, and distant howls echoed faintly. It was unsettling, but nothing unnatural. What shook me most was the sound of footsteps. Soft, heavy footsteps coming closer. Not animal footsteps. They were too deliberate, too steady. They circled the hollow, stopping just beyond the thin branches I was hiding behind. I didn't dare move or make a sound. My mind raced. Was it a wild animal? A lost hiker? Or something worse? I stayed frozen until the footsteps moved away, slowly disappearing into the darkness. The fear made it impossible to sleep, but eventually, exhaustion took over. I woke a few hours later, just before dawn. At first light, I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I packed up and tried a different direction, heading downhill toward a faint sound of running water I heard earlier. Water usually meant a river or a road nearby. The terrain was rough. I slipped on wet rocks, cut my hands on sharp branches, and my legs were covered in scrapes. But after nearly an hour, I reached a small creek. The water was clear, cold, and fast-moving. I drank and refilled my bottle. Following the creek downstream, I hoped it would lead me to civilization. The forest slowly thinned, and I could hear faint noises, birds, wind, and eventually, a distant hum of engines. After another hour, I saw the edge of a dirt road. Relief flooded me. I stumbled onto the road, coughing and tired. After walking a short distance, I spotted a truck parked by the side and a man unloading supplies. I waved my arms wildly. He noticed me, hurried over, and called for help on his phone. They gave me water, food, and wrapped my scratched arms with bandages. I told them I'd gotten lost on the trail and had spent the night in the woods. They said the part I'd wandered into was known for being tricky, with many unmarked paths and dense thickets. People had gotten lost there before. Some had even been injured. When I finally got back to town, I felt shaken but alive. The experience stayed with me for years. The panic of being lost, the dark forest closing in, the footsteps circling in the night. It wasn't a story of ghosts or monsters, just a harsh reminder of how real danger in the wild can be, even without anything supernatural. Nature doesn't need to be scary on its own. It's enough when it feels like it might swallow you whole with no way out. I never took that trail again, and I always make sure now to bring a GPS, extra water, and tell someone exactly where I'm going. Because sometimes, the scariest stories come from the quiet places where no one is watching, and the only thing you have to trust is yourself. I still remember that hike like it was yesterday, even though it happened 5 years ago. It was the summer of 2018, and I was 26 years old. I decided to take a solo trip to the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. I had done some hiking before, but nothing this long or intense. I wanted to challenge myself, to disconnect from the world for a while, and just be alone with nature. What I didn't expect was how quickly everything could go wrong. Not because of some ghost or monster, but because of simple, terrifying human mistakes and nature's unforgiving reality. The day I started, the weather was perfect. Clear sky, warm sun, a soft breeze. The trail was busy in the morning with other hikers, but I wanted to push past the crowded sections and find a quiet spot to camp overnight. I packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and basic first aid. I didn't want to carry too much weight, but I thought I was prepared. I was wrong. By mid-afternoon, I had hiked about 12 miles and found a small clearing near a creek to set up camp. I felt proud of myself for making good time. I drank some water, ate a small meal, and took a long break sitting on a rock near the water. The creek sound was calming, and I felt like I could finally relax. Around 5 p.m., I started setting up my tent. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows between the trees. While I worked, I noticed dark clouds gathering quickly in the sky. A storm was coming, faster than I expected. The wind picked up, and I hurried to finish pitching the tent. By the time I was done, the first drops of rain were falling. I crawled inside, zipped the tent tight, and lay down to wait it out. The rain came hard, pouring for what felt like hours. The creek nearby swelled, rushing faster and louder than before. I knew I couldn't see outside well, but the sound told me the storm wasn't just any ordinary rain. It was something fierce. At some point, the tent shook violently. I felt the ground beneath me tremble slightly, a reminder that I was in the middle of nature's raw power, completely exposed. When the rain finally stopped, it was nearly dark. I unzipped the tent to check outside. The sky was still cloudy but clearing slowly. I took a careful step out and immediately felt the ground beneath me was soggy, muddy in places. The creek was swollen even more, almost at the edge of the clearing where I had set up camp. I made a decision that I didn't realize would become a nightmare. I had to move my camp higher up. The rain had flooded the area more than I thought, and if it rained again in the night, I could be trapped or worse, swept away. I packed my things quickly and started climbing the hill behind the clearing. The ground was wet and slippery, the leaves and roots slick with water. I took it slow, focusing on each step. It was dark, so I used my small flashlight, which had limited battery life. After about 20 minutes of climbing, I found a dry spot on a flat ledge surrounded by thick trees. I set up my tent again, hoping this place was safe. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. I could hear animals moving around in the forest, the rustling of branches, distant calls of owls. It was eerie, but I told myself it was normal. Nature sounds. Still, something about the silence between those noises felt different, heavier. I tried to sleep, but every crack of a branch or sudden sound made my heart jump. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up to a strange noise, a low, consistent thumping from outside. It was steady, like footsteps, but slow, heavy, and methodical. My first thought was maybe a large animal, a bear or something, but the rhythm didn't match. It was too deliberate. I stayed frozen, listening. The tent walls moved slightly as the wind blew through the trees. The thumping continued for a long time, coming closer, then stopping, then moving away, but always staying somewhere near my camp. I had no way to see clearly, and my flashlight was almost dead. I kept reminding myself to stay calm. No wild animals wanted to attack me unless provoked, right? Still, the sound unnerved me. I checked my phone, no signal. I was completely cut off. Morning finally arrived, and the sunlight filtering through the trees gave me some comfort. I packed my things again and prepared to hike out as fast as I could. I wanted no more surprises. The terrain was still muddy, and the trail less clear because of fallen branches from the storm. About an hour into my descent, I noticed strange things. Footprints, not animal prints, but human ones. Deep, heavy, and irregular, like someone had been walking through the mud with heavy boots. What scared me was that they looked fresh, maybe only a few hours old, and they were heading in the same direction I was going. My heart started racing. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, but it was clear I wasn't alone. The trail was remote, and I had expected solitude, but now it felt like I was being followed or watched. I kept telling myself it might be other hikers, but the feeling in my gut said otherwise. I tried to speed up, but was careful not to slip on the wet roots. The prints continued for miles, always close enough to keep me on edge. I had no way to contact anyone, and I didn't want to risk confrontation. After 2 more hours, I finally reached a small ranger station near the end of the trail, where the main road was. There was a man inside, a ranger, I told him about the footprints and the strange noises at night. He listened carefully, then told me something that chilled me. Apparently, in recent months, there had been reports of illegal hunters and trespassers in the area. People who didn't care about the rules and could be dangerous if confronted. They used the forest for hunting at night and had been known to threaten hikers. The ranger suggested I stay at the station until a team could check the trail and make sure it was safe. Believed but shaken, I waited there. The team later confirmed that they had found evidence of people camping illegally near where I had stayed, and some signs of fires and traps set up in the woods. I left the trail the next day, feeling grateful to be alive and safe. What made the experience so terrifying wasn't ghosts or some made-up creature. It was the raw reality that the wilderness can be unpredictable and that other humans can be dangerous. You're never truly alone, and sometimes the scariest thing is knowing there are others out there who don't play by the rules. Since then, I've been more careful about where I hike and who I trust. That trip taught me a hard lesson. Nature demands respect, and people, especially strangers in the wild, deserve caution. I survived, but I'll never forget the fear of that night, the pounding footsteps just outside my tent, and the creeping sense that I was not alone in a place I thought was safe. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the remote parts of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I was 28 at the time, in decent shape but not an expert hiker. I'd been wanting to get away from the city for a while. Work was exhausting, and the noise had worn me down. The plan was simple: a 2-day hike on a lesser-known trail, camping overnight, and then heading back. I packed my gear carefully: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for 2 days, a first aid kit, a map, compass, and my phone, though I knew I wouldn't have much signal deep in the mountains. I left early one July morning, the air fresh but already warming with the sun climbing higher. The trailhead was quiet, only a couple of cars in the parking lot. I felt a bit excited, nervous even, but mostly ready to disconnect. The first few hours went well. The trail was narrow and winding, lined with thick green trees, the scent of pine needles strong in the air. Birds called out occasionally, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush kept me company. The path grew steeper in places, but I was careful, stopping to rest when I needed. Around noon, I reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. I took off my boots and sat by the water's edge, dipping my feet in to cool down and drinking some filtered water. After a quick lunch, I continued on. The trail became rougher, more overgrown, with patches of loose rock. I kept an eye on the map, making sure I was on the right route. The forest grew thicker, shadows longer as the afternoon sun moved west. I spotted a few deer darting away between the trees, but otherwise, the area was silent except for the wind moving through the leaves. I found a good spot to camp about 3 miles from the clearing, near a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley below. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure on the uneven ground. The sun was starting to dip, casting golden light through the trees. I ate a quick dinner, freeze-dried pasta and some nuts, then settled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest at night around me. But as darkness fell fully, something shifted. The usual night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, faded into silence. The wind stopped completely. I felt an odd stillness pressing in, like the forest was holding its breath. I lay awake for a while, listening. Then I heard it, a faint sound like a soft crunching or snapping of sticks, coming from somewhere not too far away. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush. But the noise was irregular, slow, deliberate. It wasn't like the quick scurry of a small creature. I sat up in my tent and peered out into the dark. The moon was nearly full, lighting up the trees enough to make out shapes and shadows. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a normal animal moving around, but the crunching sound didn't stop. Kept coming closer, then paused, then moved again. I wasn't making any noise, hoping whoever or whatever it was would lose interest and go away. Then, suddenly, I caught sight of something, a figure, between two trees maybe 20 yards from my tent. It wasn't clear, just a shadowy shape, but I could tell it was human-sized. I froze. My heart was pounding, but I didn't want to scream or make noise. Whoever it was didn't move for a long time, just stood there watching. After what felt like minutes, the figure started moving again, slowly and quietly, disappearing deeper into the forest. I didn't dare follow or even look away until I was sure it was gone. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. I had no idea if it was a hunter, a lost hiker, or someone with worse intentions. I thought about my phone, but there was no signal. My compass and map offered no help in locating nearby roads or cabins. The next morning, I packed up quickly, still shaken. I took a different route back, trying to stay on main trails. I kept my eyes open for any sign of that figure, but saw nothing. As I got closer to the trailhead, I spotted fresh footprints in the dirt. They were too big for an animal and looked like boots. I stared at them, tracing their path toward the woods and then fading away. It was clear now that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever it was, they had been close, maybe watching me for hours. Once I reached my car, relief washed over me. I locked the doors and started the engine, glancing back into the forest one last time. On the drive home, I thought about calling the park rangers, but I wasn't sure what to tell them. No crimes, no proof, just a strange, unsettling presence deep in the woods. Days later, I learned from local forums that several hikers had reported seeing a man wandering off the trails in the same area that summer. He was described as a survivalist type, someone who lived off the grid. Authorities had searched for him after reports of suspicious behavior, but he was never found. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. I could have run into something dangerous, but I stayed calm and made sure not to panic. That trip taught me that nature is beautiful but can also hide dangers beyond the obvious. Being prepared matters, but sometimes the scariest moments come not from wild animals or harsh weather, but from the unknown people who share the wilderness with us. I still hike, but I'm more careful now. I always tell people to check in with someone before heading out, carry emergency communication devices, and stay aware of their surroundings. The forest isn't just trees and animals. It's a place where human stories unfold too, some of them quietly dangerous. That night in the White Mountains will stay with me forever. A sharp reminder of how quickly peace can turn into unease when you're truly alone in the wild. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to hike alone through the dense forests of northern Idaho. I had always been drawn to the wilderness, craving the quiet and the chance to disconnect. I was 27 then, fit and experienced enough to handle solo hikes, or so I thought. I started early one morning in July, the air cool and the sky a pale blue. My backpack was light, just essentials: water, a few snacks, a first aid kit, a compass, and a map. I had studied the route carefully before leaving. It was a popular trail that looped around a small mountain ridge and passed by several clear streams. I had planned to finish by dusk. The first few hours were peaceful. Birds chirped, and the sun filtered through the tall pine trees. The trail was well-worn and easy to follow. Every so often, I stopped to drink water or check the map. I was enjoying the solitude more than I expected. The ground was covered in dry needles and leaves, soft underfoot, and the scent of pine filled the air. Around midday, the trail started to climb steeply. I was sweating but feeling good. As I reached the ridge, I paused to take in the view. Endless green hills and a blue lake shimmering in the distance. I felt small but alive. I ate a quick snack and then continued. The path began to narrow, twisting between thick bushes and tangled roots. The forest grew denser here, darker even with the sun high above. The trees were old and tall, their bark rough and cracked. I noticed the air felt cooler, damp even. My boots slipped slightly on the mossy rocks as I carefully picked my way along. That's when I first sensed something was off. It wasn't anything I could point to. A strange silence maybe, or a feeling like I was being watched. The usual sounds of the forest had faded. No birds, no wind through the leaves. Just a heavy, still quiet. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I focused on the trail and kept moving. But then I noticed the footprints in the dirt, deep, wide, and spaced far apart. They weren't mine, and they weren't made by any animal I recognized. They looked like boot prints but bigger, heavier. I checked my compass and map again, making sure I hadn't veered off. But the trail seemed right. I quickened my pace, wanting to get past the strange stretch. Then I heard a noise behind me, a low crunch of branches snapping, faint but close. My heart jumped. I stopped and listened, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. I called out, but only my own voice echoed back. I started walking again, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The footprints were still there, as if someone had been following me, step for step. The trail bent sharply, and I almost stumbled over a fallen tree. My breath was coming faster now. Suddenly, the trail opened into a small clearing with a shallow stream cutting across it. I knelt down to drink and fill my water bottle. The sound of flowing water was a relief after the oppressive silence. I noticed something near the bank. Fresh tire tracks, muddy and wide, like from an ATV or small truck. Why would there be tire tracks here? The trail was supposed to be closed to vehicles. My unease grew. I stood up and looked around. The trees at the edge of the clearing were marked with orange spray paint, signs of logging activity or land surveying. That meant people had been here recently, but why no signs of them now? I checked the time. I had been hiking for about 6 hours. If I kept going, I should be near the end soon. I followed the trail on the other side of the stream. It twisted sharply downhill, the ground slick with moss and loose rocks. My boots slid once or twice, and I caught myself just in time. I kept looking behind me but saw nothing. As I descended, the light started to fade. The canopy above thickened, blocking out most of the sunlight. I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, the left path was the main trail back to the parking lot, while the right path was a shortcut through the woods. I debated for a moment, tired and anxious. The shortcut was supposed to save me an hour. I decided to take it, wanting to finish before dark. The shortcut was narrow and poorly marked. The bushes scratched at my arms, and the trail was rocky and uneven. I had to slow down and watch every step. The silence returned, heavier than before. Then I heard it. Faint voices, low and muffled. I froze, heart pounding. No one else was supposed to be on this trail. I strained to listen but couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, I saw movement ahead, a figure stepping behind a tree. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, but it looked large and carried something long and thin on their shoulder. Panic set in. I debated running but didn't want to lose the trail or make noise. Instead, I kept moving, trying to stay out of sight behind bushes and trees. The voices grew louder, but the figures stayed hidden. I was shaking now, my breath ragged. I tried calling out, but no answer. Then the path ended abruptly at a steep drop-off leading to a narrow creek far below. I had no choice but to turn back. I hurried up the trail, trying to retrace my steps, but the way was blocked by fallen trees and thick underbrush. The figures had moved closer, their voices now clear enough to hear words like search and find. I ran blindly through the forest, tripping over roots and rocks, branches whipping at my face. The sun was almost gone, and darkness was closing in fast. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, I burst out onto the main trail near the parking lot. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. I looked back into the woods one last time, but there was no sign of the figures. The next day, I went to the ranger station to report what I had seen. The rangers listened but said there was no record of any illegal activity or people reported in the area. The logging marks and tire tracks were explained as recent but authorized work on a nearby private property. Still, I knew what I had heard and seen. People were out there, people hunting or worse. Not the hikers or campers I expected, but maybe poachers or others who didn't want to be found. The forest I loved had a darker side, one that was hidden beneath the calm surface. Since then, I've been more cautious. Hiking alone in remote places isn't always safe. Sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but real people and real danger lurking where you least expect it. That hike changed how I see the wilderness. It's not just beautiful and peaceful. It can be wild in every sense, with risks that don't show up on maps or trail guides. And sometimes the best thing you can do is respect that and be ready for anything. I set out early one September morning in 2018, heading into the Cascade Mountains near Mount Rainier, Washington. I was 27 at the time and had been hiking for years, always careful, always prepared. I had planned a solo trip, just me, my pack, and the wilderness. The forecast was clear, the air was cool but not cold, and the leaves were just starting to turn colors. Perfect for a long day hike. The trail started off well enough, wide dirt path, shaded by tall pine trees, with the sound of birds and the distant rush of a creek. I carried a small day pack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map, plus a compass I knew how to use. My boots crunched on the dry needles and twigs as I moved steadily uphill. After about 3 miles, the trail narrowed and started to wind through denser forest, the trees growing closer and the canopy thickening so the sunlight barely broke through. It was peaceful but felt a bit more isolated, as if I'd stepped away from the world. I remember noticing how quiet it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. The forest floor was soft with moss and fallen leaves. The trail became less clear, with branches and roots crossing the path. At some point, I lost sight of the trail markers. The red paint on the trees, usually easy to spot, was faint or missing entirely. I stopped, pulled out my map, and tried to figure out my position. The GPS on my phone was weak, almost no signal, so I couldn't rely on it. I kept going, telling myself I just needed to get to the ridge I could see faintly through the trees up ahead. But the trail was disappearing, and the trees seemed to press in tighter. The quietness started to feel unnatural, like something had drained the forest of life. The longer I walked, the more uneasy I became. My skin prickled. I tried to shake it off as normal nerves in the wild. Then I heard the sound. At first, it was just a faint crack, like a twig snapping somewhere off the trail. Then another coming closer. Not in a pattern like animals do, but slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like a deer or squirrel. It was footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps, but I couldn't see anyone. I froze and strained my eyes in the dim light. No one. The silence returned. I told myself it was probably a hiker or a hunter somewhere nearby, but my gut said otherwise. I looked around, no sign of other people, no bright colors or movement, just trees and shadows. I decided to turn back. Retracing my steps was harder than I thought. The trail was less visible, covered by leaves and branches, and I felt a growing panic as I realized I wasn't sure which way I had come from. I slowed down, trying to find a familiar tree or rock, but everything looked the same. The footsteps came again, closer this time. My heart hammered in my chest. I stopped, listening hard. Then, from behind a large pine, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving quickly between the trees. No clear shape, just a shadow darting through the forest. I didn't wait to see more. I started running downhill, stumbling over roots and rocks. My breath was ragged, and my legs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The forest was a maze. Every turn looked the same. The figure seemed to keep pace with me, always just out of sight but never far. I felt watched, hunted. The natural sounds of the forest had disappeared. It was just me and this unknown thing moving through the trees. I reached a narrow stream and crossed it, slipping on wet stones, barely keeping my balance. I hoped the water would mask my scent or slow whoever was behind me, but I wasn't sure it mattered. The footsteps were still there, muffled but unmistakable. I forced myself to keep moving until I saw a familiar trail marker nailed to a tree. Relief hit me like a wave. I was near the main path. I slowed, trying to listen and see if the footsteps followed me onto the wider trail. For a few tense minutes, nothing. Then nothing at all. I made it back to my car as the sun dipped below the horizon. I was soaked with sweat, clothes torn in places, my pack half open and spilling gear. I didn't stop to look back, just locked the doors and drove away, hands trembling on the wheel. Later, when I told friends, some said it might have been a hunter or someone else camping nearby. Maybe, but the way the footsteps followed, the way the figure moved too fast and too quietly, it didn't feel right. I checked local reports for any missing hikers or incidents but found nothing. No one else had reported strange encounters in that area. After that day, I never went back to that part of the forest alone. I learned that nature is unpredictable, and sometimes the scariest moments don't come from monsters or legends, but from the very real fear of being alone and lost in a place that suddenly feels hostile. The unknown is terrifying when you realize you might be watched, and there's no one around to help. That day taught me to always be prepared, yes, but also to trust my instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Hiking isn't just about the beauty or the exercise. It's about respect for the wild, and for the fact that sometimes the biggest danger is something you can't see clearly but know is there. Since then, I stick to well-marked trails, hike with others, and carry a whistle and pepper spray. I never want to feel that helpless and scared again. Because out there, in the silent trees, the shadows don't always hide animals. Sometimes they hide people you don't want to meet, and that's a fear that never really leaves you. I remember that day clearly. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo hike through the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I was 29 then, in decent shape but not an expert outdoorsman. I packed light, a day pack with some water, a few granola bars, a map, a compass, and my phone, though I didn't expect much signal once I got deep in the woods. I told myself this would be a simple day trip, hike up a popular trail, enjoy the view, and be back before dark. The morning was bright and cool, perfect for hiking. I started early, around 7 a.m., with the sun just peeking over the ridges. The trail was quiet. I passed a few groups of hikers heading in the opposite direction, smiling and nodding. The air smelled fresh with pine and damp earth. Birds were singing somewhere high above. The path was clear, well-marked, and not too steep at first. As the hours passed, the trail began to climb more sharply. I kept steady, focusing on the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, and the occasional sound of branches swaying in the wind. After about 3 hours, I reached a narrow ridge with a beautiful overlook. The mountains stretched endlessly on the horizon. I paused to drink water, eat a granola bar, and take some pictures. It was around noon then. The sun was high and I felt good. I decided to continue past the overlook toward a less traveled side trail I'd read about online. The guidebook mentioned it was a shortcut to the summit but warned it was rough and rarely used. Feeling confident, I left the main path and entered the thicker woods. The trail quickly became overgrown. Branches scraped my arms and face. The ground was uneven, with loose rocks and roots that threatened to trip me. I had to slow down and watch every step carefully. The canopy above was dense, casting shadows that made it hard to see far ahead. The sounds of the forest seemed to change too. The usual birdsong faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by my own breathing and the crack of twigs underfoot. After about an hour on this side trail, I noticed something strange. The trees around me were marked with red paint, not the usual trail blazes, which are often blue or white. These marks were rough, smeared, almost like someone had used a thick brush and slapped them on carelessly. They appeared on every tree along the path at random intervals. I stopped to check my map and compass. The map didn't show any trail matching this one, and the compass told me I was heading west, but I wasn't sure if I was still on course for the summit or had wandered off entirely. I decided to keep going, hoping the marks would guide me somehow. Then I heard a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A soft thud, 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 like something heavy hitting the ground nearby. I froze and listened closely. The noise stopped, then started again, further down the trail, but this time slower and heavier. My heart rate quickened. I didn't want to panic. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal moving through the brush. Still, I moved carefully, trying to stay quiet. The thudding noises came and went, sometimes close, sometimes fading into the distance. After about 20 minutes, I reached a small clearing. The sunlight broke through the trees, and I could see the forest floor covered with fallen leaves, broken branches, and scattered rocks. I looked around, trying to spot whatever was making the noise. There was nothing visible, but the feeling of being watched settled in my gut. Then I noticed something else. A piece of torn fabric stuck on a branch, dark blue, like the sleeve of a jacket. It looked old, like it had been there for days, maybe weeks. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I didn't recognize the fabric, and I hadn't seen anyone else on this trail today. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was none. No bars, no chance to call for help or even check GPS. My water bottle was half empty, and I realized I hadn't eaten since the granola bar an hour ago. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. I decided to turn back, retrace my steps to the main trail. But when I tried, the red marks seemed to multiply, crisscrossing in confusing patterns, sometimes pointing left, sometimes right. I stopped to look at the compass again, but the sense of direction felt lost. The trees all looked the same, tall and thick, with bark rough and gray. Panic began to creep in. The thudding sounds came back, louder this time. It was no longer random. I could hear heavy footsteps, slow but steady, moving parallel to the trail but deeper in the woods. I stopped and held my breath. The footsteps paused too, then resumed but farther away. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the growing fear. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but the sounds were too big, too purposeful to be a deer or bear moving naturally. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A large shape between the trees, partially hidden but unmistakable. It was a man, tall and wearing dark, rugged clothes. His face was hidden by shadows, but his posture was stiff, almost unnatural. He didn't move toward me, just stood there watching. I stopped dead. My mind raced. I didn't have a weapon, no way to defend myself. My only option was to stay calm and not show fear. Slowly, I backed away, eyes fixed on him. The man didn't follow but didn't leave either. I retraced my steps carefully, ignoring the red marks this time and trusting the compass. The heavy footsteps followed at a distance, never getting closer but never disappearing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found the main trail again. The relief was immediate. The sunlight was fading, but the forest felt less menacing. I walked quickly but carefully back toward the trailhead. The man, the fabric, the strange marks, all still fresh in my mind. When I reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking. I called the park ranger on my phone, telling them about the strange man and the marks. Later, I learned that police had been searching for a missing hiker in that area, someone who had disappeared weeks before. The torn fabric matched the jacket the missing person was last seen wearing. I never saw the man again, and I never took that shortcut trail. The experience left me shaken, but taught me to respect the wilderness and trust my instincts. Sometimes, the scariest moments don't come from monsters or ghosts, but from real danger hiding in the silence of the woods. I was 27 years old when I decided to go hiking alone in the Cascade Mountains of Washington in the summer of 2018. I had done plenty of hikes before, nothing too extreme, but enough to feel comfortable with the outdoors on my own. I wanted to clear my head, away from the noise of the city and work stress. The plan was simple: a 2-day hike starting from a small trailhead near Mount Rainier National Park, with a loop back to my car. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, a map, and my phone, though I didn't expect to get much signal in the backcountry. The morning was perfect. The sky was clear, the air fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I started early, moving at a steady pace along the dirt trail, passing small creeks and wildflowers. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves were constant companions. About 2 hours in, I reached a ridge that gave a breathtaking view of the valley below. I stopped for a break, took some photos, drank water, and ate a few nuts. After the ridge, the trail began to descend into denser forest. The sunlight filtered through the tall trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The silence deepened. The chirping of birds became less frequent. I knew this part of the trail was less traveled. I checked the map on my phone to make sure I was still on course. No signal, but GPS was working, so I felt reassured. Then I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been clear dirt, suddenly looked disturbed. There were deep scratches in the bark of several trees, about chest height. At first, I thought maybe it was from animals, bears or mountain lions, but the scratches were too high and seemed deliberate. They zigzagged, almost like marks made by a sharp tool. I felt a knot in my stomach, but pushed the thought away, telling myself it was probably something left by other hikers or forestry workers. As I continued, the forest grew darker, the canopy thicker. The air was cooler and damp. The sound of a distant rushing stream guided me as I walked deeper. The trail became narrower, less defined. I had to watch my steps carefully to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. I stopped to drink water and noticed my hands were shaking slightly. I told myself it was just nerves or fatigue. Then came the moment that changed everything. I saw footprints on the ground. Not the regular shoe prints I expected, but bare footprints. They were large and deep, pressed into the soft earth. The size alone was unsettling, but what caught my attention was their direction. They didn't follow the trail. Instead, they veered sharply into the thick underbrush on my right. I hesitated, looking around. The forest was eerily quiet now. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my breathing and the occasional crack of twigs underfoot. My heart beat faster. I knew I shouldn't follow, but curiosity and a strange sense of unease pushed me forward. I stepped off the trail and into the bushes, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footprints led deeper into the forest, and the ground beneath was wet and muddy. I noticed broken branches, flattened grass, signs that something big had passed recently. I stopped again when I spotted something more alarming. Pieces of torn clothing caught on a branch, fabric colored dark green, probably from a jacket. It looked fresh, maybe from a struggle. A cold sweat broke out on my back. I debated turning around, but I felt compelled to keep moving forward, hoping to find a reason for all this. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere ahead and to my left. It was not loud, but clear enough to freeze me in place. My eyes scanned the shadows, but I couldn't see anything. I knew the Cascades had wildlife, including bears and cougars, but this sound didn't match anything I'd ever heard. It was deeper, harsher. I realized I was not alone. Panic began to rise. I had no weapon, only a small pocket knife in my backpack, which was useless against a large animal. I started moving backwards slowly, trying to retrace my steps without making noise. But the forest seemed to close in on me, branches scraping my arms, roots trying to trip me. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping behind a tree, a rustle in the bushes. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the muddy ground. My knee scraped painfully, and I dropped my water bottle, which rolled away with a loud clatter. I froze, expecting something to rush toward me, but nothing came. I took deep breaths, trying to calm down and get up quickly. I decided I needed to get back to the main trail and get out of the forest as fast as possible. I hurried through the underbrush, using the map to orient myself. The growling didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched remained. Every step felt heavier, my legs burning with exhaustion. Finally, I reached the main trail, relief flooding through me. I didn't look back. I kept a steady pace, pushing myself to move faster even though my knee throbbed and my clothes were soaked with sweat and mud. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows again. I realized my phone battery was low and I had little chance of signal until I got closer to the trailhead. I didn't stop until I saw the familiar clearing where I had parked my car that morning. As I approached the parking lot, I saw a park ranger talking to two hikers nearby. My voice was hoarse when I called out to them and explained what I had found. The strange scratches, the footprints, the torn clothing, and the growling sound. The ranger nodded gravely and said there had been recent reports of illegal hunters in the area, poachers known for using traps and hunting at night. They sometimes abandoned their catch or injured animals and people when caught. The torn jacket could have been from someone caught in a trap or escaping from danger. The growling might have been an animal in distress or even the sounds of these hunters. The ranger said they would investigate the area, but warned me to be careful and not hike alone in the backcountry without telling anyone. That night, safe at home, I sat by the window, thinking about how close I had come to a real danger. Not some ghost story or fantasy, but something all too real and human. The wilderness is beautiful, but it can hide darker things. Since then, I never hike alone without a plan and always make sure someone knows where I am. That trip taught me the importance of respect for nature and caution when venturing into wild places. The scars on the trees, the footprints, and the torn jacket were silent reminders that sometimes the scariest things out there aren't monsters, but people and the wildness they bring with them. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to go hiking alone in the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains. I had always found peace in the woods, away from the noise of the city and the constant pull of technology. I was 27 at the time, physically fit, and experienced enough with outdoor activities to feel confident going solo. My plan was simple: hike a 15-mile loop trail I'd read about, camp overnight, and come back the next day. Nothing out of the ordinary, just me, my backpack, and the wilderness. I started early in the morning, the sun just breaking through the thick canopy. The air was crisp and fresh, smelling of pine and damp earth. The trail was narrow, winding through towering trees with roots jutting out like nature's obstacles. Every step I took, I could hear the soft crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots. Birds chirped high above, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. For the first few hours, everything was normal. I took my time, stopping occasionally to drink water, adjust my pack, and take in the scenery. The trail climbed steadily, and I passed a few small clearings where the sunlight dappled the ground in warm patches. I saw tracks of deer and maybe a raccoon or two, but no signs of other people. By late afternoon, I found a small stream cutting across the path. I stopped to refill my water bottle and take a short break on a large rock nearby. The water was cold and clear, and I could see small fish darting just beneath the surface. After drinking, I felt refreshed and ready to push on. That's when things started to feel off. As I continued, I noticed the trail was becoming less defined. The undergrowth grew thicker, branches reaching out and snagging my jacket. The sky above began to cloud over, a gray mist creeping between the trees. The sounds of birds and animals faded until it was just me and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. At one point, I stumbled upon a section where the trail looked like it had been disturbed. Broken branches, scuffed earth, and odd footprints I didn't recognize. They were large, irregular, and spaced strangely. I stopped to study them but couldn't place the creature that left them. It wasn't a bear or a deer, or any other animal I was familiar with in those parts. A cold knot of unease settled in my stomach. I kept moving, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint sound behind me, something heavy moving through the brush. I froze, heart pounding. I waited, ears straining, but the sound stopped. I took a cautious step forward, then another, trying not to panic. The trail narrowed further, and visibility dropped as the fog thickened. Night was coming faster than I expected. I knew I had to find a safe place to camp soon. I scanned the area and spotted a small clearing near a stand of pine trees, far enough off the trail to feel hidden, but close enough to keep track of my route. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and prepared a small fire. The act of building the fire gave me something to focus on, calming my nerves. The forest grew eerily silent as darkness fell. No crickets, no frogs, just the occasional creak of a tree swaying in the wind. I kept my knife close and my flashlight at hand. I ate a little food from my pack, feeling the cold creeping into my bones despite the fire. Then I heard it again, this time much closer. The crack of a twig snapping, heavy footsteps circling the clearing. I didn't dare shine my light directly into the darkness beyond the fire's glow, but I could see vague shapes moving just past the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe it was a bear or a wild animal, but the movements seemed deliberate, calculated. I stuffed my jacket into my backpack and grabbed my small but sharp hatchet, a tool I always carried for safety. I knew bears were a real threat in those woods, but something about the way these sounds circled me didn't feel natural. I sat as still as possible, trying to control my breathing and listen. The footsteps paused, then silence. The fire flickered low as I stayed alert, every muscle tense. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, occasionally adding small twigs to keep the flames alive. Every sound made me jump. A branch cracking, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of an animal. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, I was exhausted but relieved. I quickly packed my things and started back the way I came, keeping my eyes peeled and senses sharp. The trail was still faint, but I remembered the turns. I moved briskly, the weight of fear pushing me forward. A few hours later, I reached a fork in the path where I had taken a wrong turn earlier. That's when I noticed fresh footprints again. This time they led off the trail, heading deeper into the woods. I paused and looked around. Nearby, A broken branch stuck out like a warning. My gut screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to stay calm. I chose the safer path, the one marked on my map. The forest slowly opened up, the trees thinning as I approached the edge of the mountain. The sun was bright now, warming my face and drying the sweat on my back. I was almost out. Just before reaching the parking area, I saw something that froze me for a moment. A crude campfire pit, cold and unused, but around it were fresh scraps of food wrappers and an empty bottle. It was clear someone else had been here recently. Not the kind of hikers I knew. The feeling of being watched came back stronger. I didn't stop to investigate. I walked fast until I was back at my car, heart pounding but safe. I locked the doors and sat for a while, catching my breath. The woods had kept their secrets, but I knew I had come too close to something dangerous, something not wild but not human either. In the end, I didn't tell anyone much about that trip. The story doesn't have a neat ending with rescue or confrontation. I survived because I stayed calm, stayed alert, and chose the safest path when I could. Sometimes the scariest things in the wilderness aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the unknown people, the strange sounds, and the feeling that you're not alone, even when you thought you were. That hike taught me to respect the woods, but also to trust my instincts. The mountains hold many dangers beyond the animals and the weather. And sometimes the real fear isn't what you see, but what you don't. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the North Cascades of Washington. I was 28 at the time, working a desk job that had been eating away at me for years. Hiking had always been my escape. Something about the quiet isolation of the woods felt like the only time my head stopped buzzing. I picked a long, lesser-known trail that ran through dense forest, crossed a few creeks, and eventually led to a high ridge where you could supposedly see all the way to Canada on a clear day. I planned for 2 days, one to hike in, one to hike out, with a single night of camping in between. I remember leaving my car at the trailhead early that morning, the air still cool and the fog sitting low in the trees. My backpack was heavier than it needed to be, but I liked being overprepared. I had enough food, water filters, a first aid kit, and even an emergency blanket. The dirt trail wound between tall pines and thick brush, and I walked for hours without seeing anyone. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant sound of a bird or a branch snap from an animal somewhere off the trail, but mostly it was just the crunch of my boots and the rhythm of my breathing. By mid-afternoon, I was deep into the forest. The sun had started to fall behind the ridge, casting long shadows between the trees. I found a flat patch of ground near a small stream and decided to set up camp there. It wasn't an official campsite, but it looked good enough. Level ground, running water nearby, and enough space for my small tent. I unpacked, pitched the tent, gathered a bit of wood, and made a small fire just as the temperature started to drop. For a while, it felt perfect. The orange firelight flickering against the trees, the faint sound of running water, and the smell of pine and smoke mixing in the air. I ate one of my packed meals and sat there staring into the fire until the last light faded from the sky. When darkness settled in, it was complete. There were no stars, no moonlight, just pitch black woods and the quiet crackle of fire. That's when I heard something, faint at first, like movement through dry leaves. I thought maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. I froze, listening. Came again, slow steps somewhere off to my right, past the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but all I saw were layers of dark trunks and the silvery mist from my breath. After a minute, the sound stopped completely. I tried to shake it off. It's normal to hear things in the woods. Branches fall, animals move, wind shifts. But as I sat there, I realized it hadn't sounded random. The steps had a pattern, slow, deliberate, like someone walking cautiously. I told myself it was nothing and went into the tent, zipping it shut. The forest outside went quiet again, unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat feel loud. I must have drifted off at some point, but a sound woke me later that night. A snapping branch, closed this time. I lay there, completely still, listening. The fire outside had burned down to faint red embers, and I could barely make out shadows shifting through the thin fabric of my tent. Something or someone was moving near the campsite. I could hear the crunch of leaves, soft and slow, circling the tent. I didn't breathe. The steps moved around me, maybe 10 or 15 feet away, then stopped again. The quiet was unbearable. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine the light, but I couldn't move. I just waited, frozen in my sleeping bag, every muscle tight. After maybe a minute or maybe 10, I don't know, the sound started again, this time fading away into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, heart pounding, flashlight clutched in my hand. When the first bit of gray light came through the trees, I finally crawled out. The ground was damp, and the forest was still covered in mist. Everything looked normal at first. My gear, the fire pit, the trail nearby, until I noticed the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. Human. They came in from the direction of the trail, stopped near my tent, circled it, then went back toward the trees. I packed my things fast. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. I could tell by the pattern of the tracks that whoever it was had been there during the night, just walking around my camp while I was asleep. I followed the trail back the way I came, moving fast but trying not to run. I kept glancing behind me, but I didn't see anyone. About 2 miles down, I found something else that made my stomach twist. An old, weathered tarp, half buried in the brush beside the trail. It looked like someone had used it for shelter. There were a few empty cans and a pile of ashes nearby, cold but recent. Someone had been living out there, maybe for days, maybe longer. I didn't stop to check it closely. I just kept walking, trying to stay alert, trying to ignore how every sound made me flinch. I kept imagining someone following a few minutes behind, just far enough that I couldn't see them. The woods felt different now, less peaceful, more closed in, like the trees themselves were watching. By late morning, I reached the trailhead. My car was right where I left it, but when I looked around, I noticed another vehicle parked about 50 feet away. An old dark green SUV with mud splattered all over it. It hadn't been there when I arrived the day before. I didn't see anyone nearby, but the driver's door was slightly open. I tossed my gear in the back of my car and got in. The moment I started the engine, I felt that deep, animal urge to just go. I pulled out fast, heading down the narrow dirt road that led back toward the main highway. As I looked in the mirror, I saw the green SUV's door slowly closing, like someone had just stepped out of sight. I didn't stop until I hit the first gas station an hour later. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I checked my phone, no signal from where I'd been, of course. I thought about calling the park rangers to report it, but what would I even say? Someone walked around my tent at night? Someone might have been living out there? It wasn't illegal to camp off-trail, and there wasn't any proof of a threat. I never went back to that trail again. I kept hiking after that, but I stayed on marked routes, closer to people, closer to safety. Every now and then, though, I'll be in a quiet forest and hear that same slow crunch of footsteps somewhere behind me. The same careful rhythm, and for a split second, it feels like that night all over again. Like someone out there remembers me just as clearly as I remember them. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to hike a section of the Cascadia Ridge Trail in northern Oregon. I was 28 back then, still working as a mechanic in Portland, and I used to hike alone most weekends just to get away from the noise. That morning, I left my apartment before sunrise and reached the trailhead around 7:30 a.m. The air was cool, a bit misty, with that damp forest smell that always made me feel calm. The plan was simple: follow the ridge up about 10 miles, camp near the stream that cut across the eastern side, and hike back down the next day. I'd done longer hikes before, and nothing about this one seemed risky. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, which, looking back, was my first mistake. The first few hours were quiet except for birds and the crunch of my boots over damp leaves. The trail wound through tall pines and fir trees that blocked most of the light, so it always felt dim, even when the sun came out. Around noon, I stopped near a flat rock to eat. I remember sitting there listening to the woods, how still they were. Every now and then I'd hear something faint, like branches cracking deeper in the trees, but I brushed it off as deer. The air was colder than I expected, and by early afternoon, clouds started to roll in. Around 3 p.m., I crossed a narrow wooden bridge that spanned a shallow creek. On the other side, the trail started to climb sharply upward, switchback after switchback. The higher I went, the darker it got under the canopy. I noticed the woods here were denser, almost tangled. Ferns grew thick, and the path was barely visible in spots. I started to feel uneasy, not scared exactly, just that strange alertness you get when you realize how far you are from anyone else. No phone service, no sounds except wind and my own steps. By the time I reached what I thought was the halfway point, the sky had gone gray and heavy with clouds. The air smelled like rain. I decided to set up camp early since the area had a small clearing beside a dead tree that looked like a good windbreak. I dropped my pack and walked a bit farther up to scout the next section of trail, but I found something that made me stop. About 50 yards from my camp spot, there was an old tarp half buried in the dirt. It was torn and covered in pine needles, but underneath it I could see the corner of what looked like a backpack. I knelt down and brushed off the dirt. The backpack was sun-faded, the zippers rusted, and when I turned it over, the straps snapped like dry twigs. It had clearly been there for years. Inside there were a few things: an empty water bottle, a crushed granola bar wrapper, a small camping stove, and a cracked phone. Nothing unusual, but the phone had a sticker on the back that said, "Cody's Adventure 2014. It felt odd, like someone had left in a hurry. I tossed it back where I found it, figuring it wasn't my business, and returned to camp. That night, the rain started around 7 p.m. I cooked noodles under the tarp, zipped myself into the tent, and tried to sleep. I could hear the wind pushing through the trees, and every so often, something heavy dropped onto the tent, probably pine cones. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I couldn't tell why. The rain had stopped. The woods were completely silent. No wind, no dripping, just silence so deep it felt unnatural. Then I heard it. Faint footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, moving through wet leaves. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but the steps were too spaced out, too careful. I lay still, listening. The sound circled the tent once, then stopped. I didn't move. My heartbeat was so loud it felt like it was shaking the air inside the tent. After maybe a minute, the steps faded away into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light came, I got out and looked around. The ground was soaked, soft, covered in small puddles. I could clearly see footprints in the mud, not boots, but bare feet. Long, wide prints. Someone had been walking barefoot in the rain, circling my tent. I followed the tracks a few feet, but they vanished into the thick brush behind the clearing. My stomach dropped. I wanted to leave immediately, but the trail downhill was steep, and I needed to pack properly. So I rushed through it, barely ate, and started down. The hike back felt endless. Every sound in the woods made me stop. At one point, I noticed small bits of torn fabric stuck to branches. Pieces of some old dark jacket, frayed from years of weather. I didn't remember seeing them on my way up. I kept walking faster, trying not to look behind me. The forest felt heavier, quieter, as if everything was watching. Around halfway down, the fog rolled in thick. The path started disappearing beneath my feet. My GPS wouldn't turn on, battery dead. I checked my map, but I couldn't match any of the landmarks anymore. Everything looked the same. Wet trees, moss-covered rocks, and mist so thick it made the air taste like metal. I tried to stay calm and follow what I thought was the right direction, but after another hour, I realized I had somehow looped back near that same wooden bridge from the day before. Only this time, one of the boards was missing. It looked freshly broken, like someone had stepped on it recently. That was when I heard a faint rustle on the far side of the creek. I froze, staring through the fog. I could barely make out a shape between the trees. A person, maybe crouched or bent over. The shape moved, slow and quiet, as if trying not to be seen. I blinked and it was gone. My chest felt tight. I didn't wait. I turned and followed the creek downstream, figuring it would eventually lead me back toward the highway. My legs burned from walking through wet brush, slipping on rocks, cutting my hands on branches. Hours passed, and still I saw no signs of people or roads, just the endless trees. By late afternoon, I finally heard something, cars, distant but real. I pushed through until the trees thinned out and I stumbled onto a dirt road. A faded wooden sign read, Service Access Road 43. I knew that road led back toward the main highway, so I followed it until I reached my car, soaked, exhausted, shaking. The sun was already setting. I didn't look back at the woods once. 2 days later, I went online to see if anything had ever happened on that trail. I found an old post on a hiking forum from 2015. A hiker named Cody Turner had gone missing in that same area. The picture showed a young guy with a blue backpack and a sticker on it that said, Cody's Adventure 2014. They never found his body. I still hike sometimes, but I've never gone back there. Every time I see mist settling in the trees or hear branches breaking in the woods, I remember those barefoot prints circling my tent, and I wonder if whoever or whatever left them had been watching me from the moment I found that old backpack. It was late September of 2018 when I decided to hike alone through a section of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I was 32 at the time, working as a surveyor, and I often took solo trips into the wilderness to clear my head. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't a seasoned survivalist either. I just liked quiet places, the kind where you could hear your own heartbeat and the faint crunch of gravel under your boots. I'd been dealing with weeks of stress and wanted some isolation, so I took 3 days off work, packed light, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The plan was to start near a small town called Darby, hike up a ridge that bordered a creek, camp near an old fire lookout site that was abandoned years ago, then loop back down the other side of the ridge the next day. I had studied maps, printed the route, and saved coordinates on my phone just in case. Everything looked straightforward, about 20 miles total, most of it forested with occasional steep climbs. The first part of the hike was calm and uneventful. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. The ground was covered with brown needles, and the soft sound of running water echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods. The trail climbed gradually through tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight, so the air felt cool even though the sun was bright above the canopy. Occasionally, I heard a squirrel dash through leaves or a branch snap from the weight of a bird. For hours, nothing unusual happened. By mid-afternoon, I was about 8 miles in, where the trail narrowed and crossed a rocky slope. Below was a long drop into the valley, with a stream running through it. I remember stopping there to drink water and eat a protein bar. I could see far across the opposite ridge, where dark green trees looked almost black in the distance. The wind was starting to pick up, sharp and cold. That was when I noticed something odd. A distant sound, faint but clear. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like a dull metallic thud. followed by another, like something heavy hitting rock. I assumed it was maybe a falling tree or loose rock from a landslide, though it didn't sound natural. Came from somewhere further up the trail. I waited for a few minutes, then kept walking, brushing it off as nothing important. The trail got rougher after that. It was clear that not many people used it anymore. Some of the markers were faded, and a few fallen trees blocked the path. The smell of pine turned into something else. A faint, burnt scent, like old smoke or charred wood. When I reached a clearing around 5 in the evening, I found blackened stumps and what looked like remains of a small fire pit. It must have been from a previous hiker, but there were no footprints or trash, nothing fresh. I decided to keep moving before it got dark. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the woods changed. Everything became quieter. The sound of insects faded, and even the wind seemed to stop. The silence made me uneasy, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. I was only about 2 miles from the old lookout site where I planned to camp. I pressed on, moving faster. The trail curved along the side of a steep hill. I started noticing deep prints in the dirt, large, heavy boot marks that didn't look fresh but also not too old. I could tell someone had been there within the past week. That wasn't strange by itself, but the direction bothered me. They were going downhill, the opposite direction of where I was heading. Each print was spaced wide apart, like the person was moving fast, maybe even running. I told myself not to think too much about it and kept going. When I finally reached the fire lookout, it was nearly dark. The structure was mostly gone, just the concrete base and rusted metal poles left standing. The view stretched endlessly, but I barely looked. I was tired and just wanted to set up camp. I found a flat spot about 20 feet away, cleared some sticks, and pitched my small tent. I ate a quick meal, then crawled into my sleeping bag. The air was freezing. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't from cold or noise. It was something else, a feeling, like the air had changed. My heart started beating faster for no reason I could explain. I unzipped the tent slightly and listened. First, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard that same sound again, the dull thud of something heavy striking rock. Only this time, it was closer, much closer, came in slow intervals. One thud, then another. It didn't echo like falling rocks would. It sounded controlled, deliberate. My stomach tightened. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was just an animal moving through debris, maybe a deer or elk kicking stones. But it kept going, steady, with pauses between each sound. Minutes passed before it stopped. The silence afterward was almost worse. I strained my ears for any movement, but there was nothing. The air was so still that I could hear my heartbeat. I stayed like that for nearly an hour before exhaustion forced me back to sleep. When I woke up at dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The cold bit through my clothes. I scanned the area, and everything looked normal. Trees, rocks, frost on the ground. But when I walked toward the old lookout base, I saw something that made me stop. In the thin layer of frost covering the dirt, there were footprints. Not mine. Large, booted, heavy prints. They came from the direction of the trees and stopped just 10 feet from my tent. Then they turned around and went back the way they came. I froze. Whoever it was had been standing there while I slept. I packed up immediately. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my stove twice. I didn't eat. I didn't look around. I just started moving fast down the trail I came from. Every noise behind me made me turn, expecting to see someone. There was no one, but I could feel it, like eyes on my back the whole time. About an hour down, I saw something else. Off to the side of the trail, about 15 yards into the trees, was a small blue tarp. It was half buried under leaves. At first, I thought it was trash, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked closer. Under the tarp were old camping supplies, a torn sleeping bag, a dented pot, and a pair of shoes. Everything looked abandoned, but not for long. The fabric wasn't faded, and the edges of the tarp weren't dirty enough to have been there for months. Whoever left it had done so recently. I backed away fast and kept moving, almost jogging now. I didn't stop again until I was 3 miles from the trailhead. By then, my legs were burning and my throat was dry. I remember glancing over my shoulder and seeing nothing but endless pine trunks fading into mist. Still, the feeling didn't leave. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my gear inside and sat there with the doors locked, just breathing. The forest looked peaceful from the outside, like nothing had ever happened. But I couldn't shake the thought of those footprints near my tent. The sound of those deliberate thuds in the dark, the blue tarp hidden just off the trail. I drove straight home without stopping. I never reported it because I couldn't even describe what I saw. Just signs of someone else out there, someone who watched me sleep, maybe followed me part of the way down. It's been years now, but every time I hike alone, I still catch myself glancing at the tree line, waiting for that sound to come again. And whenever I set up camp, I always make sure to check the frost around my tent in the morning, just to see if anyone came close while I was sleeping. It was early October of 2019 when I decided to go hiking alone in the northern part of Montana. I had been working a desk job for years, and my head felt like it was full of static. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind that only thick woods could offer. I packed light: a tent, some freeze-dried food, a small gas burner, water filter, flashlight, a knife, a sleeping bag, and my phone. I planned to hike a section of trail that cut through a stretch of forest known for being quiet and isolated. Most people avoided it because it wasn't maintained anymore. That's what drew me to it. I wanted to feel alone. I parked my car off a dirt road near an old ranger station that hadn't been used in decades. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The forest felt still in a way that made my footsteps sound too loud. It wasn't a creepy kind of silence, just heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The trail wasn't marked clearly anymore. Fallen branches and overgrown plants covered sections of it, but I followed it anyway, tracing faint footprints left by deer and maybe the occasional hiker. I hiked for most of the day, climbing over rocks and walking through damp patches where rainwater had gathered. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing with a few tall fir trees on one side and a steep drop on the other. I set up camp there. I could see layers of forest stretching out below, fading into fog as the sun dipped lower. I boiled water, ate, and sat watching the mist roll through the trees. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, I slept early. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to a faint sound outside my tent. It wasn't loud, more like soft rustling. At first, I figured it was wind, but the air was still. I listened carefully and heard it again, something brushing against the tent fabric near my feet. I stayed still, my hand on the knife beside me. The sound stopped. A few seconds later, I heard soft crunches, like someone stepping carefully on leaves. Then it stopped completely. I waited, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Nothing else happened, and after about half an hour, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. Around my tent were faint footprints, bare footprints. Not boots or shoes. The ground was damp, so the prints were clear. They were small, not childlike, but thinner than most adult ones. The weird thing was they came from the direction opposite the trail, from deeper into the woods. I stared at them for a while, trying to come up with a reason someone would be barefoot out here. Maybe another hiker? Maybe someone camping nearby? But I hadn't seen anyone all day yesterday. I brushed it off, packed my things, and decided to continue hiking a few more miles before heading back. The forest grew denser as I moved on. The trees were so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. The air smelled like wet soil and pine. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. Not even birds. Every time I stopped to drink water, I felt the silence pressing against me, like the woods were watching. I kept telling myself it was just in my head. By early afternoon, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. I turned around several times, but there was nothing there, just trees. Once, I thought I saw movement, something shifting behind a fallen log. But when I focused, there was nothing. I kept walking faster now. At some point, I realized I had wandered off the main trail. I couldn't find any of the markers or old cut logs that usually line it. Everything looked the same, green, gray, endless. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. The battery was already at 40%. I decided to retrace my steps, but the ground was uneven, and it was hard to tell which direction I'd come from. Every few minutes, I would stop, listen, and scan around. That's when I started hearing it again, soft footsteps. They matched my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I walked, they followed. I turned suddenly, shining my flashlight, even though it was still daylight under the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I was sure I wasn't alone anymore. I kept walking until I found a small stream and decided to follow it downhill. Streams usually lead back to some kind of open area. It was getting late, the sky dimming through the canopy. I was tired, thirsty, and tense. Then, I noticed something ahead. An old campsite, a collapsed tent, a burned-out fire pit, and some rusted cooking gear. Everything looked like it had been there for years. The tent was torn wide open, the fabric shredded. A few feet away, there was a jacket half buried in dirt. I crouched down and picked it up. It was stiff from weather and age. Inside one of the pockets, I found an old ID card, the photo faded. The date said 2012. The name didn't matter, but the face stuck with me. Someone had been here before, and they hadn't made it out. As the sun went down, I felt panic start to creep in. The forest darkened fast, and I could barely see 5 feet ahead. I decided to camp near the stream, even though every instinct told me not to. I didn't want to keep walking blind. I set up my tent quickly, ate a small meal, and sat inside, trying to calm myself. My hands were shaking. I kept thinking about those barefoot prints and the sound following me. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer moving through brush, or a raccoon curious about food smells. But I'd never heard footsteps that matched mine so perfectly. That night, it came closer. I was lying still when I heard faint breathing outside the tent. Slow, steady, human breathing. Then the sound of something lightly dragging against the fabric near my head. I held my knife tight and didn't move. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever. Then it slowly faded away. I didn't sleep after that. I sat awake until dawn, every sound amplified in the dark. When morning came, I packed my gear and left fast, following the stream until it finally opened into a rocky slope. I could see the valley below and the faint line of a road far in the distance. It took me most of the day to reach it. By the time I made it back to my car, the sun was setting again. My legs were scraped, my clothes filthy, but I'd never felt so relieved to see asphalt. A week later, I couldn't stop thinking about the campsite I found. I searched online for missing hikers in that area. There was a report from 2012 about a man who vanished near that same section of forest. They never found him. The last note in the file said, "Believed to be lost due to terrain and weather conditions." No mention of anyone else being there. No answers. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone, and never without checking where I'm going. Sometimes when I'm walking a trail, I still think about those footprints, the way they appeared out of nowhere and circled my tent. And I always wonder if maybe I wasn't the first one who felt followed out there, or if someone else might still be wandering those same woods, barefoot, waiting for someone new to step too far off the trail. It was early September of 2014 when I decided to hike alone through the San Isabel National Forest in Colorado. I had done a few solo hikes before, but this one felt different from the start. I was 29 back then, and going through a rough time in life. My job wasn't going anywhere, my apartment lease was ending soon, and I just wanted to get away from everything for a while. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a small stove, and my camera. I wanted peace, some kind of silence that only deep woods could give. The trail I picked wasn't one of the popular ones. It was narrow and rough, barely maintained, and according to an old ranger map, it looped around a small ridge before cutting through a valley. I reached the trailhead around 9 a.m. The air was cold, and the first bit of the trail ran through tall pine trees that let very little sunlight through. The forest floor was covered in brown needles that muffled my steps. For the first few hours, everything felt calm. I could hear nothing but my breathing and the distant trickle of water somewhere downhill. By noon, I stopped to eat. I remember the air being still, too still. The forest was so quiet that even opening a bag of trail mix sounded too loud. I didn't think much of it and kept going deeper. Around 3 p.m., I reached a part of the trail that seemed less used. The ground had patches of moss and ferns, and I started noticing signs that maybe people hadn't been through here for a long time. Fallen logs across the path, broken branches, no boot marks. That uneasy feeling started creeping in when I realized my GPS wasn't picking up a signal anymore. I had marked my route on an old topographic map, but the forest around me didn't look exactly like what I'd seen online. The trees were denser, the slope steeper. I kept going, thinking I'd find a clearing soon. I didn't. By 5 p.m., I still hadn't reached the ridge that was supposed to open up to the valley. The light was fading faster than I expected. The forest got darker and colder, and everything around me looked the same: tall, gray trunks and thick undergrowth. I finally decided to set up camp beside a dry creek bed. The ground there was soft but flat enough for my tent. I gathered some sticks and lit a small fire using my portable stove. When the sun went down, the woods came alive with sounds: snapping branches, rustling leaves, small animal footsteps. It wasn't unusual, but for some reason, every sound felt too close, too deliberate. I tried to ignore it, ate a quick dinner, and lay inside my tent. I could still hear things moving outside. Maybe deer, maybe something else. I told myself it was normal and closed my eyes. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. There was a sound: slow, heavy footsteps on the dry leaves outside. Not quick like an animal, but careful, measured steps, like someone trying not to make noise. My heart started racing. I stayed completely still. The steps came closer, then stopped right outside the tent. I could hear my own breathing inside the sleeping bag. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. Then, whatever it was, walked away, slow and steady, until I couldn't hear it anymore. I didn't sleep again that night. I waited until the sky turned gray, then packed up and started walking as soon as I could see. I wanted out of there fast, but after an hour of hiking, I realized I wasn't back on the trail. I had somehow drifted off the path entirely. The forest all looked the same in every direction. No trail markers, no footprints, nothing. I tried using my compass and followed the direction where I thought the ridge was supposed to be. Hours went by and still no sign of it. Around noon, I found something strange. It was a tree stump, freshly cut, and beside it was an old, rusted axe head half buried in dirt. The stump looked clean, almost too new compared to the decayed surroundings. I couldn't understand why someone would be chopping wood this deep in the forest where no trail went. Not long after that, I noticed more signs. Small pieces of trash, an old tin can, a half-burnt log, and what looked like the remains of a campsite. But it wasn't recent. Everything was weathered, overgrown with moss. I crouched near it and saw something odd. A torn piece of blue fabric snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a jacket. I don't know why, but the sight of it made my stomach twist. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I set up my tent in silence and stayed inside with my flashlight off. Around midnight, I heard the same footsteps again. Slow, steady, circling. Then silence. Then a faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the tent fabric. I froze completely. My mouth went dry. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, but from the other side. I waited until it faded away. I didn't dare look outside. When morning came, I stepped out and saw clear boot prints in the dirt near my tent. They were human, not mine. They were bigger, and the tread pattern didn't match my shoes. I felt a wave of panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. I packed up and moved quickly downhill, following the direction of a stream I found. Streams often lead to roads or camps. By afternoon, I reached a clearing. I was exhausted, covered in scratches, and dehydrated. I saw something metallic glinting through the trees. A small tin shack with a broken roof. I approached it, thinking maybe it was a ranger shed or something similar. When I got close, I saw that the door was missing and the inside was a mess of junk. Old cans, broken tools, and an old sleeping bag that looked like it had been there for years. But the worst part was what I saw behind it. There was a pile of bones, animal mostly, but mixed in were things that weren't animal, like a torn piece of hiking boot, a shredded backpack strap, and a rusted metal water bottle just like the one I carried. I froze completely. My throat felt tight. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the tree line. That's when I heard it again, the same slow steps, coming from somewhere behind the shack. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I ran downhill, through brush and mud, scraping my legs and arms on everything in my way. I kept running until I saw a dirt road ahead. It looked abandoned, but I followed it, running for what felt like forever until I saw the roof of a parked truck. It turned out to be a logging road that connected to the main highway. I don't remember much after that except stumbling into a small ranger station later that evening, shaking, covered in dirt, barely able to speak. When they went back to check the area I described, they didn't find the shack. They said there were signs of illegal hunting camps, but nothing that matched what I told them. I never went back there again. Even now, years later, I can still remember those footsteps outside my tent. The slow, careful steps of someone who knew I was there and didn't want to be seen. I tell myself it was just some hunter, maybe a hermit, but deep down, I know whoever was out there wasn't lost like me. They lived in those woods, and I had walked too far into their silence. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to hike alone in the Cascade Range of Washington. I was 27 back then, and I had gotten too used to city life. I wanted quiet, space, and a few days away from people. I picked a section of the trail that wasn't too popular, somewhere near Snoqualmie Pass, where most hikers didn't go past the first few miles. I had 3 days off work, a backpack full of food, a sleeping bag, and enough water to get me through the trip. I planned to hike up a long ridge, camp somewhere around the halfway point, then loop back down through another trail. I checked weather forecasts, clear skies, no sign of storms. It all looked fine. The first part of the hike was calm and uneventful. I started around noon, the sun filtering through tall pines and the air cool enough that I didn't sweat much. The sound of the wind moving through the trees had that low, steady hum that makes everything feel timeless. I saw deer a few times, and once a hawk glided right over me. There was no one else around, not even parked cars near the small dirt lot where I started. I liked that. I felt free, almost invisible. By evening, I reached an area where the trees started to thin out, and I could see more of the valley below. The air grew colder as the sun dipped behind the ridge. I found a small clearing beside a dry creek bed and decided to set up camp there. The ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I ate instant noodles, boiled water over a small stove, and watched the last bit of sunlight fade. When it got dark, it was really dark. No city glow, no distant headlights, just the faint light from my small fire and the stars above. The silence was deep enough that I could hear every tiny movement in the woods. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it. A faint snapping sound from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. It was too sharp, too intentional. I held still, my heart beating faster, listening. Then another sound came, softer this time, like a footstep in dry leaves. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. I stayed still for a long time, but I didn't hear anything else after that. Eventually, I fell asleep again, though it was a light, uneasy kind of sleep. The next morning, I packed up early and kept going. The trail got steeper, winding through patches of dense brush where sunlight barely touched the ground. I kept hearing faint noises in the distance throughout the morning. Snapping twigs, a rustle in the trees, but every time I stopped to listen, it went silent. I told myself it was nothing. That's what happens when you spend too much time alone in the woods. Your brain starts building patterns from every sound. Still, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. By mid-afternoon, the trail became harder to follow. Some parts were overgrown and a few markers were missing. I relied on my GPS, but the signal kept cutting in and out. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker for nearly an hour. When I checked my phone, the map froze. I cursed quietly and tried to backtrack, but the woods looked the same in every direction. It was getting late, and I didn't want to panic. I decided to follow the slope downward, assuming it would eventually lead me toward a stream or a recognizable path. After another half hour, I came across an old logging road. It looked unused for years, overgrown with grass and lined with rotting stumps, but it was at least something man-made. I decided to follow it, hoping it would connect to a maintained trail. I walked for what felt like hours, but the road just kept twisting deeper into the forest. As the light started to fade again, I knew I had to stop soon. I picked a spot near an old pile of cut logs and made camp again. I was exhausted, hungry, and starting to feel uneasy. That night was worse. I barely slept. Around 10 or 11 p.m., I heard something again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close. The kind of close where you know it's within 50 feet. I turned off my small lantern and sat still inside my tent, holding my breath. I could hear soft crunching in the pine needles. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. Slow, measured steps. I waited for it to move away, but it didn't. It just circled. My heart was pounding so loud that I could hear it in my ears. Then, there was a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against metal. I had a small hatchet lying outside near my pack, and that's what it sounded like. Someone or something brushing a boot against it. I stayed like that for almost an hour, not moving. Eventually, the sounds faded into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for the first bit of dawn light before unzipping the tent and looking around. There was nothing. No footprints that I could clearly see, no signs of an animal, nothing disturbed except my hatchet. It was lying several feet away from where I'd left it. I stared at it for a long time, trying to think of how it could have rolled or slid, but the ground wasn't sloped at all. I felt a deep, cold tension in my stomach. I packed everything in record time and started walking again. By noon, I realized I wasn't heading in any clear direction. My compass still pointed north, but I couldn't match anything to the topography on my map. The forest felt endless, all the trees starting to look the same. I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. An old boot print near a stump, pieces of blue tarp tangled in a bush, a rusted tin can with holes punched into it. Someone had been out here before, but there were no signs of a trail. Around 4 p.m., I finally saw something ahead through the trees, a clearing with what looked like a small wooden structure. I thought maybe it was an old ranger station or a hunting cabin. I felt relieved just to see something man-made. When I got closer, I saw that it was no cabin. It was a small shack, made from uneven boards, leaning to one side with the door hanging half open. There was trash scattered around, and the remains of a small fire pit. The smell of rot hung in the air. Inside, it looked abandoned. A few old cans, a torn sleeping bag, and a pile of tools rusting in one corner. But what froze me was a row of small bones laid out neatly on a board. Not animal bones, at least not from anything small like squirrels. They looked long, too uniform, maybe from deer, but the way they were arranged felt deliberate. I didn't stay to study them. I felt my throat tighten and a deep urge to get out. I backed away slowly and started walking again, fast this time, without caring what direction I was going as long as it was away from that place. As I moved further downhill, I began hearing something behind me again. Quick footsteps, then silence. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Kept happening, always the same distance away. I didn't look back. I just kept moving faster until the trees started thinning and I could see an open slope ahead. My legs burned, and my chest felt tight from breathing so hard. Finally, I saw a dirt road cutting across the valley below. I stumbled down toward it, almost running. When I reached the road, I just collapsed on the gravel, shaking and out of breath. A couple of hours later, a truck came by, an old Forest Service vehicle. The driver stopped, asked if I was okay, and I just nodded. He gave me a ride back toward town. I never told him what I saw or what I thought had happened. I didn't tell anyone. Later, when I checked the maps again at home, I realized the area I had wandered into wasn't even part of the official trail system anymore. It had been closed off years ago because of illegal hunting and missing persons. The logging road I followed led straight into that section. I still hike sometimes, but never alone anymore. Every time I hear a twig snap behind me, I get that same frozen feeling, that same heavy silence pressing in. I try not to think about the sound of those slow footsteps circling my tent, or the bones laid out neatly on that wooden board. But sometimes at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint crunch of someone walking just out of sight, keeping their distance, just like before. It was late September of 2014 when I decided to take a solo hike through the Black Creek Ridge Trail in northern Colorado. I was 27, living alone back then, working a job that kept me inside most of the week. I needed some quiet. I'd hiked before, but never that far and not alone. The plan was to go in early morning, make it to a clearing by noon, rest, and return before dark. I packed my bag with the basics: water, a few protein bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and an old folding knife I'd had since college. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The trail started out easy: dry dirt, pine needles, and the sound of my boots crunching through them. The air was cool and still, except for the faint rustle of leaves. I liked that sound, the way it carried in the distance. The first few miles passed quietly. I saw a few birds scatter from a fallen log, a squirrel dart up a tree, and the occasional patch of sunlight breaking through the branches. About 2 hours in, the path began to narrow. It wasn't overgrown, but I could tell not many people used this part of the trail anymore. The trees grew closer together, thicker, and the air got damp. I started to notice that silence again, not peaceful silence, but the kind that feels heavy. I couldn't even hear insects. I didn't think much of it, just assumed maybe it was the time of year. A few miles in, I found a fork in the path that wasn't marked on my map. One way curved left downhill, the other continued slightly upward. The uphill route looked more worn, so I followed that. After a few minutes, the trees began to open, and I came to a flat ridge overlooking the valley. I could see far out over the trees, and the sun was high. I sat on a rock, drank some water, and took a short break. When I started again, I noticed something odd. The path behind me didn't look the same anymore. I knew it should have led straight back to the fork, but now there seemed to be more turns, like faint side trails I hadn't noticed before. I turned around to double check, trying to match the trees or any markers, but everything looked too similar. Same dark bark, same deadfall, same patches of moss. I told myself I'd just keep going straight and I'd eventually find my way back down. But after walking for another half hour, I realized I wasn't heading downhill at all. The ground was still sloping upward, and the air was getting colder. My phone had no signal, which didn't surprise me, but the time made me uneasy. It was already past 2 in the afternoon. I decided to turn back, tracing my steps as carefully as I could. That's when I saw it, the boot print. At first I thought it was mine, but when I looked closer, I noticed it was pointing toward me, not away. It was fresh too, pressed deep in the dirt, maybe from a few minutes earlier. I looked around, but the woods were still. My heart started to beat faster, but I kept walking. Maybe someone else had taken the same path. It wasn't impossible. After another few minutes, I noticed more footprints. Some were overlapping, some faded, but there were definitely at least 2 sets. One looked like mine, thicker sole, hiking boot tread. The other was narrower, maybe a work boot or something similar. They weaved slightly, like whoever left them wasn't walking straight. I followed them downhill, hoping they'd lead me back to the main trail, but they didn't. They just kept winding deeper into the woods. At one point, I spotted a small clearing with what looked like a fire pit. Just a circle of blackened stones and ashes that hadn't been touched in a long time. Near it was an old, rusted camping chair and a torn tarp half buried in leaves. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned years ago. Something about it felt wrong, like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. I didn't stay long. I backed out and tried to keep my direction consistent, but my nerves were getting worse. I kept hearing faint cracks behind me, like branches snapping under weight, but every time I turned, nothing was there. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer moving through the woods, but the sound seemed to keep pace with me, pausing when I paused, starting when I moved. Around 4 o'clock, the light started to fade faster than I expected. The sky went gray, and the wind picked up. I tried to stay calm, but the woods looked completely different now. Every direction looked the same. I couldn't find any familiar marks or landmarks. My flashlight was still in my bag, but I didn't want to use it yet. That's when I smelled smoke. Faint, but there, like burning wood somewhere close. I followed the smell, hoping it meant people or maybe a campsite, but as I got closer, the scent grew stronger and more bitter. When I came through the trees, I saw the same clearing again, the same fire pit, the same rusted chair, but now there was fresh smoke rising from the ashes. I froze. The air around the pit shimmered faintly, like heat was still coming off it. I looked at the ground. Those same boot prints circled the pit, newer this time, deep and uneven. Whoever had been here was close. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel it, that pressure of being watched. My chest tightened. I slowly backed away, trying not to make noise. I didn't run at first, but after a few steps, something snapped behind me. A sharp crack, heavy, like someone stepping hard on a branch. I turned and ran. I didn't care what direction, just away. My bag hit my side, branches whipped my face, and I could hear quick steps behind me for a moment before they stopped. When I finally stopped to breathe, the woods were silent again. I kept moving until the light faded completely. My flashlight barely cut through the dark, and my battery was already half gone. I found a flat patch near a rock wall and decided to stay there until sunrise. I didn't sleep. I kept hearing faint movement all night, soft crunches, slow steps in the leaves, sometimes far, sometimes close. Every time I turned my light on, the sound stopped. When the sky finally turned gray again, I started walking in what I guessed was east. After an hour, I finally found the main trail again. It looked wide and open, and I could see old wooden signs I recognized from earlier that day. Relief hit me hard, but I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead and saw my car. When I got home, I looked up Black Creek Ridge online. I found an old local article from 2009 about a man who'd gone missing there while camping alone. They'd found his campsite and boot prints that led in circles but never found him. The area where they last saw signs of him was near an unmarked fork and a small clearing with a fire pit. I haven't gone hiking since. Sometimes I still think about that night. The sound of those steps behind me, the smoke from the pit, and the way the woods seemed to close in tighter the longer I stayed. I tell myself I just got turned around, that it was my own footprints and my own fear. But part of me knows I wasn't alone in those woods. Someone else was there. Someone who didn't want to be found. It was early September 2018 when I decided to hike a trail I'd never done before. A narrow, twisting path in northern Montana called the Crow's Ridge Trail. I had taken a week off work, planning to camp near Glacier National Park, but I wanted something quieter, away from the usual tourist spots. Crow's Ridge wasn't officially part of the park, just outside the border. An old forestry trail that cut through a mix of pine and aspen forest, about 12 miles long. From what I'd read online, it wasn't too hard, but long and not well maintained. That was exactly what I wanted. Peace, isolation, a kind of stillness you only find deep in the woods. I started out just after sunrise, around 6:30 a.m. The air was cool and damp, and the sky was pale gray. My backpack felt heavier than usual, probably because I'd packed extra water and a few energy bars. I remember the smell of pine needles crushed under my boots, the soft crunch that echoed faintly around me. There was no wind, no sound except the quiet rhythm of my footsteps and the distant call of a jay somewhere up the ridge. The first few miles were steady and calm. The trail wound along the edge of a slope that overlooked a deep valley, with a small stream glinting in the bottom. The path was narrow but visible, just covered in dry leaves and a few fallen branches. Around the 4th mile, I started noticing signs of old campsites. Ringed stones, rusted cans, bits of broken glass. It looked like people hadn't been up there for years. I took a break at an open clearing around mile 5. The clearing was wide, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. I dropped my pack, took a drink, and sat on a log. The quiet there felt heavier than usual. Not peaceful, but almost pressing. I thought maybe it was the altitude or the still air, but I remember how sharp every little sound felt. My own breathing, the creak of the straps on my pack, even the faint rustle of a leaf somewhere behind me. When I got up to leave, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. A single hiking boot lying on its side. It was dirty, the sole half peeled off, but it looked newer than the trash I'd seen earlier. Next to it was a torn piece of red fabric caught on a root. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket. I figured someone had lost it years ago, but I still felt that tiny pinch of unease that makes you look around for no reason. The woods were silent again, almost too silent, and I moved on quicker than I meant to. The further I went, the rougher the trail became. Roots jutted out, rocks slid under my feet, and the forest grew denser. Around mile 7, I started noticing strange things. Small piles of stones stacked along the edge of the path. They weren't natural. Each one had about 6 or 7 rocks, balanced too neatly to be random. They appeared every few hundred feet, always on the right side of the trail. I thought maybe someone used them as markers, but they didn't seem to mark anything. The trail was still clear, just winding deeper into the woods. By mile 8, I hadn't seen another person or even an animal. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The air felt heavier, almost muffled. The only sound was my own breathing and the steady rhythm of my boots against dirt. When I stopped to drink again, I realized I couldn't tell which direction the sun was in anymore. The sky was overcast, thick with dull gray clouds. The forest looked the same in every direction. Tall, dark trunks and deep green shadows between them. Around that time, I noticed something new, faint footprints in the dirt ahead of me. They were fresh, not boots like mine, but lighter, maybe sneakers. I crouched and looked closer. They seemed to belong to one person, walking the same direction I was heading. The prints weren't old, maybe a few hours at most. My first thought was relief. Someone else had been on the trail. But the more I followed them, the stranger it felt. They weren't steady. Sometimes they veered off the path slightly, then came back. A few times they looked like they'd stopped and turned around before continuing. Whoever it was, they hadn't walked in a straight line. By mile 9, I reached a steep incline where the trail bent sharply up the ridge. The prints kept going. I was tired and sweating, but I pushed on. The climb was rough, loose dirt, slippery rocks, and a long drop on one side. When I finally made it up, I noticed something ahead. Another clearing, smaller this time. In the center was a fire pit made of stones, blackened with old ash. Around it were a few scattered items, a broken flashlight, an empty water bottle, and a torn sleeping bag. It looked like someone had camped there not too long ago. The footprints ended near the fire pit, then vanished into the woods on the far side. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the trees. The forest felt wrong in a way I can't explain. Every instinct in me said not to move forward. The silence had changed, not empty, but tense, like the woods were holding their breath. I turned slowly, checking behind me, and for a brief second I thought I saw something move between the trees. Not a person, not clearly, just a shift, a flicker of dark movement that didn't match the windless stillness of everything else. I froze, staring into that spot, but there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the faint smell of old smoke. I decided to go back down the ridge. The unease in my stomach was stronger than any sense of curiosity, but going down was worse. Every few minutes I heard small sounds, dry twigs snapping somewhere behind me, soft crunches that stopped when I stopped. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it never came closer or went away. It just followed steady, slow. By the time I reached the clearing with the lone boot again, the sky had darkened. The light was fading fast, and the woods had turned gray and quiet again. I wanted to rest, but I didn't dare stop. Every sound made my skin crawl now, every rustle, every breath of wind. I remember glancing over my shoulder constantly, seeing nothing but shadows stretching between the trees. I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, my throat dry. It felt like I was being watched, the kind of feeling that crawls up your spine and won't leave. Once, when I turned sharply, I thought I caught sight of something pale behind a tree. Not clothing, not clear enough to identify, but it vanished when I blinked. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was almost dark. My car sat alone in the gravel lot. I tossed my pack in the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The woods disappeared behind me, swallowed by the dark. I didn't stop until I reached the small town of Columbia Falls, nearly an hour later. When I parked under a streetlight, I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to calm down. That night, in my motel room, I emptied my bag and found something that made my stomach drop. a torn piece of red fabric tangled in one of the straps. It looked just like the one I'd seen caught on that root in the clearing. I hadn't noticed it before, and I had no idea how it got there. The next morning, I reported what I saw, the boot, the torn fabric, the campsite, to the local ranger office. They said they'd check it out, but they didn't sound surprised. The man at the desk mentioned, almost casually, that a hiker went missing along Crow's Ridge a few years back and was never found. I never went back. Even now, years later, I still think about that hike, about the footprints, the silence, and the feeling that something out there followed me down that mountain. And sometimes, when I clean my hiking gear, I swear I can still smell that faint trace of smoke, like the ashes from an old campfire that never really went out. It was late September 2017 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the North Cascades in Washington. I was 29 back then, working a boring warehouse job, and I had a week off with nothing to do. I wanted a break from the noise, the constant hum of machines, the smell of diesel, the sight of concrete. I wanted quiet, trees, wind, and the feeling of being far away from everything. I had done smaller hikes before, but never one this remote. The trail I chose wasn't popular. I picked it because the internet said it was underrated and peaceful. That was what I wanted. The first day went smooth. I parked at a small dirt lot that could only fit about 4 cars. There was only one other vehicle there, an old blue pickup covered in dust. The air was cool, damp, the forest heavy with the smell of pine and wet earth. I had a 45-liter backpack with food, tent, water filter, and all the gear. My plan was to go up the mountain trail, camp near a lake, and return in 2 days. I started hiking around 10 a.m. The first few miles were easy, steady incline, soft ground, sunlight breaking through the trees in narrow beams. I could hear birds, maybe some woodpeckers far off, and the occasional rustle of something small moving in the brush. By noon, the trail started narrowing. The ground became rocky and uneven, with small switchbacks climbing sharply. I stopped for lunch beside a stream, filtered water, and rested a bit. Everything felt fine, peaceful even, but the higher I went, the quieter it became. It wasn't just less noise. It was the kind of silence where you could almost hear your own heartbeat. I kept walking, trying not to think about it. By 3 p.m., clouds started building. I checked my GPS. I was still on track, about 5 miles from the lake, but I noticed something strange. A narrow side path that wasn't on the map. It looked somewhat used, like maybe people had taken it before, maybe to cut around the slope. I followed it for a bit, thinking it might rejoin the main trail ahead. After about 20 minutes, I realized it was heading in a completely different direction. When I turned around, the path I had just walked down didn't look the same. I couldn't even tell where the original trail was anymore. I tried backtracking, looking for my footprints, but the ground was covered in pine needles and soft dirt. Everything blended together. I wasn't panicking yet, but I felt a small knot forming in my chest. I took out my GPS again, no signal. My phone was the same. I decided to keep walking downhill since I knew the main trail roughly followed the ridgeline. I figured I'd hit it again eventually, but every direction I turned looked the same. Trees, ferns, fallen logs. Started raining not long after. Just a drizzle at first, then heavier. I pulled out my rain cover and kept moving, trying to find anything that looked familiar. The forest felt different now. The light had dimmed, and everything looked washed in gray. The ground was slick, roots twisting under my boots. I slipped twice, once hard enough to scrape my arm. After what felt like hours, I came across an old campsite. Not a proper one, but something someone had used before. There was a stone fire ring, half collapsed, and an old tarp shredded by weather lying nearby. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I decided to stay there for the night since I didn't want to keep wandering in the dark. I set up my tent and boiled some noodles under the rainfly. My clothes were damp, my fingers numb. The forest was completely silent now except for the rain and the occasional creak of branches. When night came, I could barely sleep. Every sound outside felt louder. A few times I heard something moving in the trees, slow, deliberate steps, not close but not far either. Could have been a deer, I told myself. I kept my flashlight near me, just in case. At some point during the night, I must have dozed off because I woke up again to total silence. The rain had stopped. The forest was dead quiet. My watch said 2:47 a.m. Then I heard it again, footsteps. This time slower, heavier. I held my breath, trying to listen. It wasn't running or pacing, just careful steps circling near the tent. I could hear the sound of wet leaves being pressed down. My first thought was maybe a bear, but the steps sounded too precise, like a person trying not to make noise. I froze. I didn't even dare reach for my flashlight. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The steps stopped right outside my tent for a few seconds, then drifted away into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for daylight. When it finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The forest looked normal again, soaked but calm. I looked around, half expecting to see footprints, but the rain had wiped away everything. I packed up fast and started walking in what I thought was the direction downhill. I didn't even eat breakfast. After a few hours, I came across something strange again. An old logging road, completely overgrown but still visible under the brush. It wasn't on my map, but at least it was a path. I followed it for maybe an hour before I noticed more signs of people. A rusted tin can, an old plastic bottle half buried, even what looked like a collapsed wooden shack deep in the trees. When I got closer, I saw it wasn't a shack at all, but what used to be a small cabin. The roof had caved in, moss covering most of it. There were some tools scattered around, an axe head, a rusted saw, a lantern broken in half. Something about that place felt off, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The ground around it was littered with broken glass, and there was a large metal drum that looked burned out. I walked around the cabin, careful where I stepped. Behind it, there was a pit covered with old boards. When I pushed one aside, I saw animal bones inside. At least I hoped they were animal. I didn't stay long. I started following the logging road again, moving quicker now. The whole area had this heavy, stale feeling, like the air hadn't moved in years. Around late afternoon, I finally started hearing water, a stream. I followed the sound and found a small creek that looked like it might lead down the mountain. I decided to follow it. The water was cold and clear, and the ground beside it was easy to walk on. It took me nearly the rest of the day, but eventually, the trees began thinning, and I saw something that almost made me cry. A small wooden trail sign half buried in moss. It was the main trail. I don't know how far off I had gone, but I must have been several miles away from where I started. I followed the trail down until I reached the dirt parking lot again. The blue truck was still there, exactly how it had been 2 days ago. That gave me a chill. When I finally reached my car, I sat there for a long time, just breathing. The rain had stopped, and the forest was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there with me that night. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living off the grid, or maybe something worse, something human but not right. I never went hiking alone again after that. Every time I see a trail vanish into the woods, I think about those footsteps outside my tent, the old cabin, the pit behind it. I sometimes wonder who owned that blue truck and why it was still there when I left. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to go hiking alone for the first time. I had done plenty of shorter trails before, but this time I wanted something longer and quieter. away from the busy trails filled with families and joggers. I chose a place called Alder Ridge, a stretch of steep forest trails about 40 miles outside a small town in northern Montana. It wasn't a popular spot because the trailhead was hard to find, and it didn't have any fancy viewpoints or signs. Just dense woods, uneven terrain, and the sound of wind and birds. I thought that sounded perfect. I parked my car at the dirt lot beside the old ranger sign and checked the time. It was around 9:20 in the morning. The air was cool and crisp, and the ground was still damp from rain the night before. I had a 40-liter backpack with me, packed with food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a folding knife. My plan was to hike about 7 miles in, set up camp near one of the old logging clearings I saw marked on the map, and then head back the next day. I figured I'd be back at my car by noon tomorrow. The first few miles were peaceful. The forest was thick but calm. I could hear the distant rush of a creek, and the smell of wet pine needles followed me the whole way. I stopped a few times to drink water and take short breaks. Around noon, the sun started breaking through the clouds, warming the forest floor. I felt good, sweaty, but good. By the 5th mile, though, the trail began to change. It got narrower, almost disappearing under fallen branches and leaves. There were signs that people hadn't been there for a while. Rotted logs across the path, overgrown brush, and no footprints but mine. I started checking my GPS just to make sure I was still on the right route. The signal flickered, which made me uneasy, but it seemed I was heading in the right direction. I pushed through another mile and finally reached the clearing that I had planned to camp in. It was a flat, open patch surrounded by tall trees on every side. There was an old rusted piece of machinery nearby, probably something left over from the logging days decades ago. The grass was ankle-high and still wet. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and started setting up my small tent. After I finished, I sat against a log and ate a sandwich, watching how the shadows slowly changed as the sun lowered. Around 5 p.m., the forest started to grow quieter. The birds that had been calling all day stopped suddenly, as if they'd all decided to leave at once. It wasn't completely silent, but something about the way the air felt made me uncomfortable. It was heavier, stiller. I walked a bit past the clearing just to look around. About 100 feet away, I noticed what looked like another small trail branching off, one that wasn't marked on my map. It went downhill slightly, vanishing between thick trees. Something about it caught my attention. It looked like it had been used recently. The ground there wasn't as overgrown, and I could see impressions in the dirt, like old footprints or maybe animal tracks. Couldn't tell. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it for a bit before dark. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming almost a ceiling above me. I walked maybe a quarter mile before the smell hit me. Something rotten, faint but definitely there. It was a thick, foul smell that made my stomach twist. I thought maybe it was a dead animal somewhere nearby, so I scanned the ground as I moved. A few minutes later, I saw something ahead that made me stop. There was a small clearing, barely a few feet wide, and right in the middle of it was what looked like a makeshift fire pit. Stones arranged in a circle, ashes inside, but no recent fire. Around it were scraps of trash, torn food wrappers, a plastic bottle, and a piece of blue tarp folded over something. I froze for a long moment, staring. It looked like someone had camped there not too long ago, maybe just a week or two earlier. I knelt down to look closer, and when I pulled the tarp aside, I found a dirty blanket, a half-burned shoe, and what looked like the edge of a sleeping bag. I backed up slowly. Everything about it felt wrong. It wasn't like a casual campsite. There were no signs of normal camping gear, just scraps and decay. The smell was stronger now, and I realized it was coming from behind a fallen tree near the pit. I couldn't see anything from where I stood, but the odor made my skin crawl. I didn't want to look. I just turned around and walked back toward my tent as calmly as I could. By the time I got back, the light was fading fast. I zipped myself into the tent, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. Every little sound outside made me flinch. The snapping of branches, the rustle of wind. I tried to tell myself it was just deer or raccoons, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I barely slept that night. I kept waking up, listening, expecting to hear footsteps. At some point around 3 a.m., I heard something that froze me completely. It was the faint crunch of leaves, slow and steady, moving near my tent. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I didn't move or breathe. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, circling the tent once. I lay there gripping my knife, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Then the sound stopped again, completely. I waited, staring at the fabric of the tent, praying for daylight. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Nothing was there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove what I'd heard. But my gear had been moved. My backpack was a few feet away from where I'd left it, one of the zippers half open. I didn't even stop to eat. I packed up everything as fast as I could and started back down the trail. The hike back felt endless. Every noise behind me made me turn around. I could swear I saw movement between the trees a few times, but nothing clear. When I finally reached the parking area, I saw another car parked next to mine. A dark green pickup that hadn't been there the day before. The driver's door was cracked open, and the back looked piled with junk, like someone was living out of it. I didn't look long. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove until I hit the highway. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about that hidden clearing and the sound that had circled my tent. A few days later, I called the county sheriff's office and told them what I'd seen and where. They said they'd send someone to check it out. 2 weeks later, I got a call back. The officer told me they'd found the campsite I described. He said it looked like someone had been squatting out there for months, maybe longer. Then he said something that made my blood go cold. They found signs of animal bones, old food, and clothing, but also personal items belonging to a missing hiker reported earlier that summer. They never found the person who had been living there. The green pickup I'd seen that morning turned out to be abandoned a few miles from the same trailhead a few days after I left. I haven't gone hiking alone since. Sometimes I still think about how close that person must have been to me that night, walking circles around my tent, watching. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to go hiking alone for the first time. I had just turned 28 and was tired of city noise, tired of screens and work. I lived in Flagstaff, Arizona, and every weekend I'd see people heading up toward the Coconino National Forest with their backpacks and tents. They always came back looking different, like they had seen something that made them quiet inside. I wanted that. I wanted to be quiet inside for once. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, small stove, 2 days of food, water filter, flashlight, batteries, knife, and a map of the area. I planned to take a less popular trail called the Dry Creek Ridge Trail, which was about 15 miles long one way. It wasn't a tourist trail. It didn't have those easy markers or crowds. That's what I liked about it. I wanted space and silence. I wanted to just walk into the woods and not hear anyone else for a while. The first few miles were calm. The trail went through pine forests that smelled dry and warm. The dirt was packed down hard. The air felt thin but clean. Every step made the ground crunch softly under my boots. I stopped sometimes to take in the way sunlight came through the trees, cutting in golden stripes across the forest floor. It felt safe then, open enough that I could still hear the wind. Around noon, I crossed a shallow stream that ran between two wide boulders. I filled my water bottle, ate a sandwich, and kept moving. The forest got thicker after that. The trees grew taller and closer, and the trail became narrow, twisting up a long hill. My phone had no service anymore, but I didn't care. I had my map. I checked it every couple of hours to make sure I was still heading the right way. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing that looked like it hadn't been walked through in years. Fallen branches, thick grass, no signs of footprints. I decided to set up camp there because it was flat and near a small creek. I built a small fire as the sun started to go down behind the trees. I remember feeling proud of how quiet everything was. I sat there eating instant noodles, staring at the fire until my eyes started to sting. When I finally crawled into my tent, the air had turned cold. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. It felt strange, but I told myself it was just a quiet night. I fell asleep fast, but sometime around 1 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why at first, just that my eyes opened and my heart was already beating fast. I listened, holding my breath. That's when I heard it. A single crunch outside, like someone stepped on a stick. I froze. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then there was another sound, a slow, steady rustle in the grass, moving around my tent. Not fast, not panicked, just slow, like footsteps. I stayed still, barely breathing. The steps stopped right behind where my head was resting. I could hear something shifting its weight, the fabric of the tent moving slightly from the air pressure. I wanted to look, but I couldn't move. I waited, eyes open, staring at the thin orange glow from the dying fire outside. After a while, the sound faded away. I didn't sleep again that night. I just lay there waiting for dawn. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The ground was damp and cold. I looked around the clearing, trying to find any sign of what I'd heard. About 10 feet from the tent, I saw footprints.
Bare footprints.
The ground was soft enough from the creek nearby that they were clear, adult-sized, narrow, and long. They led from the tree line straight to the back of my tent and then away again, heading west. I stood there staring for a long time. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe someone had camped there before, I told myself, though they looked fresh. The ground had a thin layer of dew everywhere except inside those prints. That meant they were made recently, probably sometime during the night. I tried to shake it off, packed up my gear, and decided to keep moving. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I hiked for hours that day, deeper into the forest, trying to distract myself with the rhythm of walking. But I couldn't stop checking behind me. Every few minutes, I'd turn around, convinced I heard something. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, crawling under my skin. By evening, I reached a narrow ridge that overlooked a valley below. The trail curved down the hill, and from there I could see an old fire road cutting through the trees far below. My plan was to follow it the next day and loop back toward the main trail. I pitched my tent again on a small flat area just below the ridge, close to some tall rocks that blocked the wind. I forced myself to eat and tried to sleep early. Around midnight, I woke up again. Same sound, footsteps, but this time they weren't circling. They were approaching from the ridge. Slow, steady, heavy. My chest tightened. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. The steps stopped right outside the tent again. This time I could hear slow breathing. Not animal breathing, human breathing. Deep, calm, steady. I snapped on the flashlight and pointed it through the tent wall. The beam lit up the outline of someone standing just a few feet away. Tall, still, facing me. The light didn't scare them off. They didn't move at all. I didn't scream or say anything. I just grabbed my knife and held it close, waiting. After maybe 30 seconds, the shadow shifted and disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until the sky started turning gray. Then I packed up as fast as I could and started walking down the ridge toward the fire road. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I just wanted out. The forest was dead quiet again. No wind, No birds. When I finally reached the fire road around 10 a.m., I felt a wave of relief. It meant civilization wasn't far. I started walking faster. About an hour later, I came across an old campsite. Just ashes and a half-burned piece of tarp. And then I saw it. Hanging from a low branch nearby was a torn, dirty piece of blue nylon. It looked exactly like the color of my tent. That stopped me cold. I checked my backpack again just to make sure. My tent was still there, intact. That meant whoever had been out there, whoever had walked around my camp, had once owned the same kind of tent I did. The same brand, same color. Maybe they had been living out there, maybe they never left. I didn't stop walking until I reached the parking area by late afternoon. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't rest. I drove straight home, locked my door, and didn't unpack for 2 days. Later, when I checked online for anything about missing hikers or strange activity in that area, I found a small report from 2014. A man had gone missing while camping alone along Dry Creek Ridge. Search teams found his gear scattered in different places, but they never found him. The only detail in the article that stuck with me was that he had been using a blue nylon tent, the same one I owned. Ever since that trip, I haven't gone hiking alone again. Every time I drive past that stretch of forest, I look toward the tree line and think about those footprints, that breathing, that motionless shadow outside my tent. I tell myself it was just someone passing through. But sometimes, when I wake up at night to silence, I can still picture that shape standing just outside the thin wall of fabric, waiting for me to move. It was late September of 2018 when I decided to hike alone through the northern Colorado backcountry. I was 31 at the time, and I'd been doing solo hikes for a few years, short ones, usually no more than a night or two. But this trip was supposed to be a little longer. I had a week off from work, and I wanted to push myself. The plan was to follow an old, unmarked trail I'd found on a forum, one that supposedly led through several miles of forest, crossed a shallow river, and opened into a high valley that few people ever reached. The valley didn't have an official name on maps, but a few people called it Hunter's Gap. It looked beautiful in the satellite photos, wide meadows, cliffs, and thick pine. I packed light, just enough for 4 days, though I carried extra water and a satellite beacon, something I rarely used but figured would be smart to bring. The first day went smooth. I parked my car on a gravel turnout off a forest road near Red Cliff, loaded my pack, and started up the trail around noon. The sun was out but mild, the air cool enough to make hiking comfortable. The forest was quiet in that deep way only mountain forests are. Just the faint hiss of wind sliding through branches, the random tap of pine cones falling somewhere behind me. I remember how clean everything smelled, that sharp mix of pine and earth. The trail climbed steeply at first, switchbacking through tall firs, but by late afternoon I'd reached a plateau that leveled out into open forest. I made camp near a dry creek bed. I didn't see another person all day, which felt strange at first but kind of nice. I cooked some noodles on my stove, sat against a log, and watched the trees fade into shadow. Around dusk, I heard a faint rustling somewhere behind my camp. Maybe a deer, maybe wind, but it stopped quickly. The forest at night always makes small sounds seem closer than they are. I didn't think much about it, packed up my food bag, hung it, and slept. The next morning was colder. My tent had a thin layer of dew across it, and when I stepped out, the forest was covered in low fog. It was that kind of mist that hangs between the trees, not thick enough to block vision but enough to mute everything. The silence felt heavier. I followed the old trail north for several miles, passing through a series of narrow valleys. The further I went, the less distinct the trail became. In some places, it was only faint depressions in the soil, overgrown with grass and roots. I relied on my GPS a few times to make sure I was still roughly on course. By mid-afternoon, I reached the river crossing, a slow, waist-deep stretch of cold, clear water with slick stones underfoot. Took time to wade across, but it wasn't too bad. After crossing, the terrain got rougher. The ground rose sharply, littered with fallen trees and thick underbrush. I started noticing signs of old campsites, small fire rings, bits of foil, and an old, collapsed tarp half buried in dirt. Most of it looked abandoned for years. The sun was getting lower when I finally reached the valley. Hunter's Gap wasn't as open as I expected. The meadow area was smaller, surrounded by dense forest and ridges that rose steeply on both sides. The place looked isolated, quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. I set up camp near the tree line, close enough to the woods to find firewood. After eating, I sat near the fire until it was almost dark. That's when I started feeling something I couldn't quite explain, like the air had changed. The wind had died completely, and the temperature dropped faster than it should have. When I turned off my headlamp to get into the tent, I noticed another light deep in the trees. It wasn't bright, just a faint flicker. At first I thought it was a campfire, maybe someone else camping nearby, but it was strange how far off it looked. Too low to the ground for a fire, not moving like a flashlight either. It would fade, then glow again faintly, like something reflecting light. I watched it for several minutes until it went out. I told myself it was probably just a reflection from my own fire or maybe a small firefly. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something crunching outside. Slow steps, deliberate, moving close. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped near my tent, then shifted again, circling. I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, so I stayed quiet. The sound moved to the far side of the camp and faded into the woods. I lay still for a long time, waiting to hear it again, but nothing came. When morning came, the fog had returned thicker than before. I went out to check the area and saw tracks near the ashes of my fire, boot prints. Not mine. They were small, narrow, and the tread looked old, almost worn smooth. There were at least 2 sets, overlapping. I didn't know what to make of it. There hadn't been any voices, no other signs of people. I decided I'd hike out that day, even though it was a long way back. As I started packing, I noticed something else. My food bag, which I'd hung high on a branch, was gone. The rope was still there, but the bag itself was missing. I looked around the area, thinking maybe it had fallen or been torn down by an animal, but I couldn't find it anywhere. That uneasy feeling in my chest started to grow. I packed up fast and began hiking back toward the river. The fog made it hard to follow the faint trail, and the woods all looked the same. I tried using my GPS again, but the signal kept dropping. After an hour or so, I started hearing snapping sounds behind me. Not loud, but consistent. I stopped and listened. It would stop too. I'd walk again, hear it again. At one point, I turned quickly and caught movement through the trees. Something or someone stepping behind a trunk. My heart started pounding. I called out once just to make sure if it was another hiker, but nothing replied. Then I saw a piece of red fabric hanging from a branch about 30 yards off the trail. It looked like part of a jacket or shirt, faded and frayed. I didn't go near it. I just kept moving faster. By the time I reached the river again, it was almost evening. The air had that cold, metallic smell that comes before rain. Crossing took longer this time because I kept looking over my shoulder. Once across, I climbed the ridge fast, barely stopping for water. Every sound behind me made my stomach twist. When the sun dropped, I realized I wasn't going to make it back to the car before dark. I found a small clearing just big enough for my tent and set it up quickly, skipping a fire. I sat inside with my headlamp off, listening to the woods. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps again, slow, coming from the same direction I'd come. They stopped near my camp and didn't move for a long time. Then there was a faint metallic sound, like something brushing metal against rock. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. It must have been over an hour before I heard the steps fade away. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the first bit of gray light came through the trees, I packed and started hiking nonstop. The forest felt endless, the silence thick, my legs shaking from exhaustion. Around noon, I finally saw the faint glimmer of the road through the trees. I broke through the last stretch of brush and saw my car sitting exactly where I left it. When I reached it, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were muddy footprints leading up to the driver's side door, boot prints, small, like the ones near my camp. The car was locked, nothing broken, but those prints stopped right at the door and turned back toward the woods. I drove out of there faster than I ever had before, checking the mirror constantly, half expecting to see someone walking down the road behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never went back to that trail. A few weeks later, I checked an online forum again and found an old post from someone who'd hiked in the same area years earlier. They mentioned finding old camps, missing gear, and feeling watched the whole time. No one ever figured out who lived or stayed out there, but some said there were abandoned hunting shacks deep in that forest that never made it onto maps. Sometimes I think about those boot prints near my tent and the sound of metal in the dark, and I wonder how close they really were, how long they'd been following me, waiting in that fog-covered valley where no one goes anymore. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to hike alone for a weekend. I was 28 then, living in Portland, Oregon, and spending most of my days in front of a computer at my office job. I had been feeling restless for weeks, so I packed my gear one Friday evening and drove out toward the Mount Hood National Forest. I wanted quiet, some fresh air, and that deep silence that only exists when you're far from everyone else. The trail I picked wasn't too popular. It wasn't one of those well-kept scenic routes with warning signs and trash bins. It was a narrow, fading path that I'd read about in an old hiking forum, one that supposedly led to a ridge where you could see the whole valley stretch for miles. I got there just after dawn on Saturday. The sky was pale and cold, the air heavy with that damp forest smell that sticks to your clothes. The first part of the trail wound through thick fir trees. The ground was soft, covered in needles, and every step gave off a muted crunch. I didn't see anyone around, not even another car parked near the trailhead. For the first few hours, it was perfect. The sound of birds, a steady breeze through the branches, the occasional rustle from squirrels running in the brush. The forest was calm and alive in that quiet way that makes you feel small but safe. I followed the path as it twisted upward along a slope. Around noon, I stopped beside a fallen log to eat. The light filtered down through the trees in broken patches. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, until I noticed something odd in the dirt nearby. There were boot prints, fresh ones, but they weren't coming from anywhere. They started just a few feet from where I was sitting, like someone had been standing still there, facing the woods. No prints led up to that spot. The soil was soft, still damp from morning dew, so any movement should have left a clear trail. But there was nothing leading to or from the spot. Just a set of prints, large ones deeper than mine, and then nothing. At first, I thought maybe the ground had been disturbed and the rest of the prints had faded, or maybe I just wasn't looking carefully. But the longer I stared, the more it bothered me. I didn't hear anyone around, and the woods were too still. I told myself to ignore it and keep hiking, but from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The higher I climbed, the narrower the path became. The trees thinned out a little, letting more sunlight in, but it only made the shadows sharper. I noticed more things that didn't make sense. A torn piece of dark fabric snagged on a branch. A rusty can crushed half into the soil. A small pile of bones, animal bones probably, but the way they were arranged looked deliberate, almost like someone had set them there. I tried not to think too hard about it. People leave strange stuff in the woods all the time. By mid-afternoon, the forest had gone quiet. Completely quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even wind. Just silence so deep that every movement I made sounded too loud. I stopped once to adjust my pack, and I swore I heard something faint behind me, like a branch snapping underfoot. I looked back down the trail, but it was empty, just trees. I stood there for a full minute, staring into the dense green, waiting to hear something else, but there was nothing. I kept walking, slower now, trying to listen while pretending I wasn't. Every few minutes I'd turn around, just checking. Once or twice I thought I saw movement, a quick flash of something dark between the trees, but it might have been my mind playing tricks. The feeling of being followed settled into my stomach and stayed there. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky was already dimming. The sun had dropped behind the mountains, leaving that gray-blue light that fades too fast. I found a small clearing and set my pack down. I was supposed to camp there overnight, but the silence was so heavy it made me feel trapped. I decided I'd rest a bit, eat something, and head back down before it got too dark. I took out a protein bar and some water. As I sat there, I noticed something on the ground near the edge of the clearing. It looked like another boot print, half covered by leaves. But when I brushed the leaves away, I saw it wasn't just one print. It was several, overlapping, all leading toward where I had just come from. My stomach dropped when I realized they were the same size and shape as the ones I'd seen earlier. That was when I heard it again. A slow, heavy step from the trees. Then another. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Came from the direction of the trail I'd just climbed. I stood up, frozen, trying to see through the thick green, but everything blended together. I didn't move for maybe a full minute, and then I heard the sound again, 2 steps this time, then silence that I grabbed my pack and started walking back down. Not running, but fast enough that my heart was pounding. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every time I did, the woods behind me looked darker. The trail wasn't clear anymore either. The light had dropped fast, and everything was turning gray. My footsteps echoed strangely, like the sound was bouncing off something too close. Halfway down the slope, I came across a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There was an old tent frame there, just the poles and bits of fabric hanging off them. Nearby, a few empty cans, a torn sleeping bag, and a burned-out fire pit. It looked abandoned, but not old enough to be forgotten. The ashes were scattered but not fully washed away. Someone had used this place not long ago. The prints were everywhere around it, overlapping in all directions like whoever was there had paced circles for hours. That was the first time I felt actual fear, like something inside me clicked and said, "Leave, now." I didn't stop again after that. I kept walking until my legs ached. The woods got darker and colder, the trail harder to see. I slipped a few times on roots and rocks, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to my car. Every time I thought I'd lost that feeling of being watched, another sound, something faint like a shift of weight or a crunch, would remind me it was still there. By the time I saw the parking area, the sky was almost black. My car was the only one left. I unlocked it, tossed my pack in, and slammed the door. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys trying to start the engine. When the headlights came on, I caught one last glimpse of the trail entrance in front of me. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, tall, still just barely visible between the trees. But then I blinked, and it was gone. I drove the entire way back to Portland without stopping. The whole time, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me even though I knew no one else had been out there. I never told anyone about that trip. I deleted the photos I took and threw out the trail map. I haven't gone hiking alone since then, but sometimes when I wake up at night, I still remember those footprints, how they started without a beginning, how they waited in the dirt like someone had been standing there for a long time, watching.